Chapter 15. How many minutes to midnight? If some extraterrestrial species were compiling a history of Homo sapiens, they might well break their calendar into two eras, BNW, before nuclear weapons, and NWE, the nuclear weapons era. The latter era, of course, opened on August 6, 1945, the first day of the countdown to what may be the inglorious end of this strange species, which attained the intelligence to discover the effective means to destroy itself, but, so the evidence suggests, not the moral and intellectual capacity to control its own worst instincts. Day 1 of the NWE was marked by the success of Little Boy, a simple atomic bomb. On Day 4, Nagasaki experienced the technological triumph of Fat Man, a more sophisticated design. 5 days later came what the official Air Force history calls the grand finale, a 1,000-plane raid, no mean logistical achievement, on Japan's cities, killing many thousands of people, with leaflets falling among the bombs reading "Japan has surrendered." President Truman announced that surrender before the last B-29 returned to its base. Those were the auspicious opening days of the NWE. As we now enter its 70th year, we should be contemplating with wonder the fact that we have survived. We can only guess how many years remain. Some reflections on these grim prospects were offered by General Lee Butler, former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, which controls nuclear weapons and strategy. 20 years ago, Butler wrote that we had so far survived the NWE by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greatest proportion. Reflecting further on his long career in developing nuclear weapons strategies and organizing the forces to implement them efficiently, he described himself ruefully as having been among the most avid of these keepers of the faith in nuclear weapons. But, he continued, he had come to realize that it was now his burden to declare with all of the conviction I can muster that in my judgment they served us extremely ill. He asked, by what authority do succeeding generations of leaders in the nuclear weapons states usurp the power to dictate the odds of continued life on our planet? Most urgently, why does such breathtaking audacity persist at a moment when we should stand trembling in the face of our folly and united in our commitment to abolish its most deadly manifestations? Butler termed the U.S. strategic plan of 1960 that called for an automated all-out strike on the communist world the single most absurd and irresponsible document I have ever reviewed in my life. Its Soviet counterpart was probably even more insane. But it is important to bear in mind that there are competitors, not least among them the easy acceptance of extraordinary threats to survival. Survival in the early Cold War years. According to received doctrine in scholarship and general intellectual discourse, the prime goal of state policy is national security. There is ample evidence, however, that the doctrine of national security does not encompass the security of the population. The record reveals that, for instance, the threat of instant destruction by nuclear weapons has not ranked high among the concerns of planners. That much was demonstrated early on, and remains true to the present moment. In the early days of the NWE, the United States was overwhelmingly powerful and enjoyed remarkable security. It controlled the hemisphere, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and the opposite sides of those oceans as well. Long before World War II, it had already become by far the richest country in the world, with incomparable advantages. Its economy boomed during the war, while other industrial societies were devastated or severely weakened. By the opening of the new era, the United States possessed about half of total world wealth and an even greater percentage of its manufacturing capacity. There was, however, a potential threat: intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. That threat was discussed in the standard scholarly study of nuclear policies, carried out with access to high-level sources, Danger and Survival, Choiphase about the bomb in the first 50 years by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor during the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. Bundy wrote that the timely development of ballistic missiles during the Eisenhower administration is one of the best achievements of those 8 years. Yet it is well to begin with a recognition that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if those missiles had never been developed. He then added an instructive comment: I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal, in or out of either government, that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement. 6. In short, there was apparently no thought of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, the threat of utter destruction in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Could that threat have been taken off the table? We cannot, of course, be sure, but it was hardly inconceivable. The Russians, far behind in industrial development and technological sophistication, were in a far more threatening environment. Hence, they were significantly more vulnerable to such weapons systems than the United States. There might have been opportunities to explore the possibilities of disarmament, but in the extraordinary hysteria of the day they could hardly have even been perceived. And that hysteria was indeed extraordinary. An examination of the rhetoric of central official documents of that moment, like National Security Council paper NSC 68, remains quite shocking. One indication of possible opportunities to blunt the threat was a remarkable proposal by Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin in 1952 offering to allow Germany to be unified with free elections on the condition that it would not then join a hostile military alliance. That was hardly an extreme condition in light of the history of the past half-century, during which Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice, exacting a terrible toll. Stalin's proposal was taken seriously by the respected political commentator James Warburg, but otherwise mostly ignored or ridiculed at the time. Recent scholarship has begun to take a different view. The bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar Adam Ulam has taken the status of Stalin's proposal to be an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative, he wrote, on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing. The political, scholarly, and general intellectual failure left open the basic question, Ulam added, was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, GDR, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and for American security that could have been enormous? Reviewing recent research in Soviet archives, one of the most respected Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, observed that many scholars were surprised to discover Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the Russian secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia. Opportunities that were squandered in favor of securing German participation in NATO. Under the circumstances, it is not impossible that agreements might have been reached that would have protected the security of the American population from the gravest threat on the horizon. But that possibility apparently was not considered, a striking indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy. The Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond. That conclusion was underscored repeatedly in the years that followed. When Nikita Khrushchev took control in Russia in the years after Stalin's death, he recognized that the USSR could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest and most powerful country in history, with incomparable advantages. If it ever hoped to escape its economic backwardness and the devastating effects of the last World War, the Soviet Union would need to reverse the arms race. Accordingly, Khrushchev proposed sharp mutual reductions in offensive weapons. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it, instead turning to rapid military expansion, even though it was already far in the lead. The late Kenneth Waltz, supported by other strategic analysts with close connections to U.S. intelligence, wrote then that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in the conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence, and we did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, the government opted for harming national security while enhancing state power. The Soviet reaction to the U.S. buildup of those years was to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962 to try to redress the balance at least slightly. The move was also motivated in part by Kennedy's terrorist campaign against Fidel Castro's Cuba, which was scheduled to lead to invasion that very month, as Russia and Cuba may have known. The ensuing missile crisis was the most dangerous moment in history, in the words of historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., Kennedy's advisor and confidant. Of no slight significance is the fact that Kennedy is highly praised for his cool courage and statesmanship in the decisions made at the peak of the crisis, even though he had needlessly placed the population at enormous risk for reasons of state and of personal image. 10 years later, in the last days of the 1973 Israeli-Arab War, Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor to President Nixon, called a nuclear alert. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomatic maneuvers designed to ensure an Israeli victory, of a limited sort, so that the United States would still be in control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were indeed delicate. The United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger secretly informed the Israelis that they could ignore it. Hence the need for the nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away. The security of Americans retained its usual status. 10 years after that, the Reagan administration launched operations to probe Russian air defenses by simulating air and naval attacks and a high-level nuclear alert that the Russians were intended to detect. These actions were undertaken at a very tense moment. Washington was deploying Pershing II strategic missiles in Europe with a 10-minute flight time to Moscow. President Reagan had also announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, program, which the Russians understood to be effectively a first-strike weapon, a standard interpretation of missile defense on all sides. And other tensions were rising. Naturally, these actions caused great alarm in Russia, which, unlike the United States, was quite vulnerable and had repeatedly been invaded and virtually destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. Newly released archives reveal that the danger was even more severe than historians had previously assumed. A high-level U.S. intelligence study entitled "The War Scare Was for Real" concluded that U.S. intelligence may have underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian preventative nuclear strike. The exercises almost became a prelude to a preventative nuclear strike, according to an account in the Journal of Strategic Studies. It was even more dangerous than that, as we learned in the fall of 2013, when the BBC reported that right in the midst of these world-threatening developments, Russia's early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, sending its nuclear system onto the highest-level alert. The protocol for the Soviet military was to retaliate with a nuclear attack of its own. Fortunately, the officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decided to disobey orders and not report the warnings to his superiors. He received an official reprimand. And thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're still alive to talk about it. The security of the population was no more a high priority for Reagan administration planners than for their predecessors. And so it continues to the present, even putting aside the numerous near-catastrophic nuclear accidents that have occurred over the years, many reviewed in Eric Schlosser's chilling study Command and Control. In other words, it is hard to contest General Butler's conclusions. Survival in the post-Cold War era. The record of post-Cold War actions and doctrines is hardly reassuring either. Every self-respecting president has to have a doctrine. The Clinton doctrine was encapsulated in the slogan "multilateral when we can, unilateral when we must." In congressional testimony, the phrase "when we must" was explained more fully. The United States is entitled to resort to the unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Meanwhile, Stratcom in the Clinton era produced an important study entitled Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence, issued well after the Soviet Union had collapsed and Clinton was extending President George H.W. Bush's program of expanding NATO to the East in violation of verbal promises to Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, with reverberations to the present. That study was concerned with the role of nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era. A central conclusion: that the United States must maintain the right to launch a first strike, even against non-nuclear states. Furthermore, nuclear weapons must always be at the ready because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. They were, that is, constantly being used, just as you're using a gun if you aim but don't fire one while robbing a store, a point that Daniel Ellsberg has repeatedly stressed. Stratcom went on to advise that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values the most. Anything is a possible target. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed. That the US may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be a part of the national persona we project. It is beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control, thus posing a constant threat of nuclear attack, a severe violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares. Not much here about the noble goals constantly proclaimed, or, for that matter, the obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to make good faith efforts to eliminate this scourge of the earth. What resounds, rather, is an adaptation of Hilaire Belloc's famous couplet about the Maxim gun, to quote the great African historian Chinwezu. Whatever happens, we have got the atom bomb, and they have not. After Clinton came, of course, George W. Bush, whose broad endorsement of preventive war easily encompasses Japan's attack in December 1941 on military bases in 2 U.S. overseas possessions, at a time when Japanese militarists were well aware that B-17 flying fortresses were being rushed off assembly lines and deployed to those bases with the intent to burn out the industrial heart of the empire with firebomb attacks on the teeming bamboo ant heaps of Honshu and Kyushu. That was how the pre-war plans were described by their architect, Air Force General Claire Chennault, with the enthusiastic approval of President Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. Then came Barack Obama, with pleasant words about working to abolish nuclear weapons, combined with plans to spend $1 trillion on the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years, a percentage of the military budget comparable to spending for procurement of new strategic systems in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan, according to a study by the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Obama has also not hesitated to play with fire for political gain. Take, for example, the capture and assassination of Osama bin Laden by Navy SEALs. Obama brought it up with pride in an important speech on national security in May 2013. The speech was widely covered, but one crucial paragraph was ignored. Obama hailed the operation but added that it could not be the norm. The reason, he said, was that the risks were immense. The SEALs might have been embroiled in an extended firefight. Even though, by luck, that didn't happen, the cost to our relationship with Pakistan and the backlash among the Pakistani public over encroachment on their territory was severe. Let us now add a few details. The SEALs were ordered to fight their way out if apprehended. They would not have been left to their fate if embroiled in an extended firefight. The full force of the U.S. military would have been used to extricate them. Pakistan has a powerful, well-trained military, highly protective of state sovereignty. It also has nuclear weapons, and Pakistani specialists are concerned about the possible penetration of their nuclear security system by jihadi elements. It is also no secret that the population has been embittered and radicalized by Washington's drone terror campaign and other policies. While the SEALs were still in the bin Laden compound, Pakistani Chief of Staff Ashfaq Parvez Kayani was informed of the raid and ordered the military to confront any unidentified aircraft, which he assumed would be from India. Meanwhile, in Kabul, U.S. War Commander General David Petraeus ordered warplanes to respond if the Pakistanis scrambled their fighter jets. As Obama said, by luck the worst didn't happen, though it could have been quite ugly. But the risks were faced without noticeable concern or subsequent comment. As General Butler observed, it is a near miracle that we have escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to perpetuate the miracle. Chapter 16. Ceasefires in which violations never cease. On August 26, 2014, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA, both accepted a ceasefire agreement after a 50-day Israeli assault on Gaza that left 2,100 Palestinians dead and vast landscapes of destruction behind. The agreement called for an end to military action by both Israel and Hamas as well as an easing of the Israeli siege that had strangled Gaza for many years. This was, however, just the most recent in a series of ceasefire agreements reached after each of Israel's periodic escalations of its unremitting assault on Gaza. Throughout this period, the terms of these agreements remained essentially the same. The regular pattern has been for Israel to then disregard whatever agreement is in place, while Hamas observes it until a sharp increase in Israeli violence elicits a Hamas response, which is followed by even fiercer Israeli brutality. These escalations are often called mowing the lawn in Israeli parlance, though the 2014 Israeli operation was more accurately described by an appalled senior U.S. military officer as removing the topsoil. The first of this series of truces was the agreement on movement and access between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in November 2005. It called for the opening of a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, the continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import-export of goods and the transit of people, the reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, and the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israeli bombing had demolished. That agreement was reached shortly after Israel withdrew its settlers and military forces from Gaza. The motive for the withdrawal was explained with engaging cynicism by Dov Weissglass, a confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was in charge of negotiating and implementing it. Summarizing the purpose of the operation, Weissglass explained that the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. In the background, Israeli hawks recognized that instead of investing substantial resources in maintaining a few thousand settlers in illegal subsidized communities in devastated Gaza, it made more sense to transfer them to illegal subsidized communities in areas of the West Bank that Israel intended to keep. The disengagement was depicted as a noble effort to pursue peace, but the reality was quite different. Israel never relinquished control of Gaza and is accordingly recognized as the occupying power by the United Nations, the United States, and other states, apart from Israel itself, of course. In their comprehensive history of settlement in the occupied territories, Israeli scholars Edith Zertel and Akiva Eldar describe what actually happened when that country disengaged. The ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. Operations cast lead and pillar of defense. Israel soon had a pretext for violating the November agreement more severely. In January 2006, the Palestinians committed a serious crime. They voted the wrong way in carefully monitored free elections, placing the parliament in the hands of Hamas. Israel and the United States immediately imposed harsh sanctions, telling the world very clearly what they mean by democracy promotion, and soon began planning a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable elected government, a familiar procedure. When Hamas preempted the coup in 2007, the siege of Gaza grew far more severe, and regular Israeli military attacks commenced. Voting the wrong way in a free election was bad enough, but preempting a U.S.-planned military coup proved to be an unpardonable offense. A new ceasefire agreement was reached in June 2008. It again called for opening the border crossings to allow the transfer of all goods that were banned and restricted to go into Gaza. Israel formally agreed, but immediately announced that it would not abide by the agreement until Hamas released Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier it held. Israel itself has a long history of kidnapping civilians in Lebanon and on the high seas and holding them for lengthy periods without credible charges, sometimes as hostages. Imprisoning civilians on dubious charges, or none at all, is also a regular practice in the territories Israel controls. Israel not only maintained the siege in violation of the 2008 ceasefire agreement but did so with extreme rigor, even preventing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which cares for the huge number of official refugees in Gaza, from replenishing its stocks. 3 On November 4, while the media were focused on the U.S. presidential election, Israeli troops entered Gaza and killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That elicited a Hamas missile response and an exchange of fire. All the deaths were Palestinian. In late December, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered the offer, but rejected it, preferring instead to launch Operation Cast Lead, a 3-week incursion with the full power of the Israeli military into the Gaza Strip, resulting in atrocities well documented by international and Israeli human rights organizations. On January 8, 2009, while Cast Lead was in full fury, the UN Security Council passed a unanimous resolution, with the United States abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire leading to a full Israeli withdrawal, unimpeded provision through Gaza of food, fuel, and medical treatment, and intensified international arrangements to prevent arms and ammunition smuggling. A new ceasefire agreement was indeed reached, similar to the previous ones, but again was never really observed and broke down completely with the next major mowing the lawn episode, Operation Pillar of Defense, in November 2012. What happened in the interim can be illustrated by the casualty figures from January 2012 to the launching of that operation: 1 Israeli killed by fire from Gaza, 78 Palestinians killed by Israeli fire. The first act of Operation Pillar of Defense was the murder of Ahmed Jabari, a high official of the military wing of Hamas. Aluf Ben, editor-in-chief of Israel's leading newspaper, Haaretz, described Jabari as Israel's subcontractor in Gaza, who enforced relative quiet there for more than 5 years. As always, there was a pretext for the assassination, but the likely reason was provided by Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. He had been involved in direct negotiations with Jabari for years and reported that, hours before he was assassinated, Jabari received the draft of a permanent truce agreement with Israel, which included mechanisms for maintaining the ceasefire in the case of a flare-up between Israel and the factions in the Gaza Strip. There is a long record of Israeli actions designed to deter the threat of a diplomatic settlement. After this exercise in mowing the lawn, a ceasefire agreement was reached yet again. Repeating the now standard terms, it called for a cessation of military action by both sides and the effective ending of the siege of Gaza, with Israel opening the crossings and facilitating the movements of people and transfer of goods, and refraining from restricting residents' free movements and targeting residents in border areas. What happened next was reviewed by Nathan Thrall, senior Middle East analyst for the International Crisis Group. Israeli intelligence recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire. Israel, Thrall wrote, therefore saw little incentive in upholding its end of the deal. In the 3 months following the ceasefire, its forces made regular incursions into Gaza, strafed Palestinian farmers and those collecting scrap and rubble across the border, and fired at boats, preventing fishermen from accessing the majority of Gaza's waters. In other words, the siege never ended. Crossings were repeatedly shut. So-called buffer zones inside Gaza, from which Palestinians are barred, and which include a third or more of the Strip's limited arable land, were reinstated. Imports declined, exports were blocked, and fewer Gazans were given exit permits to Israel and the West Bank. Operation Protective Edge. So matters continued until April 2014, when an important event took place. The two major Palestinian groupings, Gaza-based Hamas and the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, signed a unity agreement. Hamas made major concessions. The unity government contained none of its members or allies. In substantial measure, as Thrall observes, Hamas turned over governance of Gaza to the PA. Several thousand PA security forces were sent there, and the PA placed its guards at borders and crossings, with no reciprocal positions for Hamas in the West Bank security apparatus. Finally, the unity government accepted the 3 conditions that Washington and the European Union had long demanded: non-violence, adherence to past agreements, and the recognition of Israel. Israel was infuriated. Its government declared at once that it would refuse to deal with the unity government and cancelled negotiations. Its fury mounted when the United States, along with most of the world, signaled support for the unity government. There are good reasons why Israel opposes the unification of Palestinians. One is that the Hamas-Fatah conflict has provided a useful pretext for refusing to engage in serious negotiations. How can one negotiate with a divided entity? More significantly, for more than 20 years, Israel has been committed to separating Gaza from the West Bank, in violation of the Oslo Accords, which declare Gaza and the West Bank to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at a map explains the rationale. Separated from Gaza, any West Bank enclaves left to Palestinians have no access to the outside world. Furthermore, Israel has been systematically taking over the Jordan Valley, driving out Palestinians, establishing settlements, sinking wells, and otherwise ensuring that the region, about one-third of the West Bank, including much of its arable land, will ultimately be integrated into Israel along with the other regions that Israel is taking over. Hence, remaining Palestinian cantons will be completely imprisoned. Unification with Gaza would interfere with these plans, which trace back to the early days of the occupation and have had steady support from the major political blocs, including from figures usually portrayed as doves, like former President Shimon Peres, one of the architects of settlement deep in the West Bank. As usual, a pretext was needed to move on to the next escalation. Such an occasion arose with the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from the settler community in the West Bank. An 18-day rampage, primarily targeting Hamas, followed. On September 2, Haaretz reported that, after intensive interrogations, the Israeli security services concluded the abduction of the teenagers was carried out by an independent cell with no known direct links to Hamas. By then, the 18-day rampage had succeeded in undermining the feared unity government. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 18 months, providing Israel with the pretext to launch Operation Protective Edge on July 8. That 50-day assault proved the most extreme exercise in mowing the lawn so far. Operation still to be named. Israel is in a fine position today to reverse its decades-old policy of separating Gaza from the West Bank and observe a major ceasefire agreement for the first time. At least temporarily, the threat of democracy in neighboring Egypt has been diminished, and the brutal Egyptian military dictatorship of General Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is a welcome ally for Israel in maintaining control over Gaza. With the Palestinian Unity government placing U.S.-trained forces of the Palestinian Authority in control of Gaza's borders and governance possibly shifting into the hands of the PA, which depends on Israel for its survival as well as for its finances, Israel might feel that there is little to fear from some limited form of autonomy for the enclaves that remain to Palestinians. There is also some truth to the observation of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Many elements in the region understand today that, in the struggle in which they are threatened, Israel is not an enemy but a partner. Akiva Eldar, Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent, adds, however, that all those many elements in the region also understand that there is no brave and comprehensive diplomatic move on the horizon without an agreement on the establishment of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders and a just, agreed-upon solution to the refugee problem. That is not on Israel's agenda, he points out. Some knowledgeable Israeli commentators, notably columnist Danny Rubenstein, believe that Israel is poised to reverse course and relax its stranglehold on Gaza. We'll see. The record of these past years suggests otherwise, and the first signs are not auspicious. As Operation Protective Edge ended, Israel announced its largest appropriation of West Bank land in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres. Israel Radio reported that the takeover was in response to the killing of the 3 Jewish teenagers by Hamas militants. A Palestinian boy was burned to death in retaliation for the murders, but no Israeli land was handed over to the Palestinians, nor was there any reaction when an Israeli soldier murdered 10-year-old Khalil Anadi on a quiet street in a refugee camp near Hebron and then drove away in his jeep as the child bled to death. Anadi was one of the 23 Palestinians, including 3 children, killed by Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank during the Gaza onslaught, according to UN statistics, along with more than 2,000 wounded, 38% by live fire. None of those killed were endangering soldiers' lives, Israeli journalist Gideon Levy reported. To none of this is there any reaction, just as there was no reaction while Israel killed, on average, more than 2 Palestinian children a week for the past 14 years. They are unpeople, after all. It is commonly claimed on all sides that, if the two-state settlement is dead as a result of Israel's takeover of Palestinian lands, then the outcome will be one state west of the Jordan River. Some Palestinians welcome this outcome, anticipating that they can then conduct a civil rights struggle for equal rights on the model of South Africa under apartheid. Many Israeli commentators warn that the resulting demographic problem of more Arab than Jewish births and diminishing Jewish immigration will undermine their hope for a democratic Jewish state. But these widespread beliefs are dubious. The realistic alternative to a two-state settlement is that Israel will continue to carry forward the plans it has been implementing for years, taking over whatever is of value to it in the West Bank, while avoiding Palestinian population concentrations and removing Palestinians from the areas it is integrating into Israel. That should preempt the dreaded demographic problem. These basic policies have been underway since the 1967 conquest, following a principle enunciated by then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, one of the Israeli leaders most sympathetic to the Palestinians. He informed his party colleagues that they should tell Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, "We have no solution, you shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where this process leads." The suggestion was natural within the overriding conception articulated in 1972 by future President Chaim Herzog: "I do not deny the Palestinians a place or stand or opinion on every matter. But certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated in the hands of our nation for thousands of years. For the Jews of this land there cannot be any partner." Dayan also called for Israel's permanent rule, Memshalat Kiva, over the occupied territories. When Netanyahu expresses the same stand today, he is not breaking new ground. For a century, the Zionist colonization of Palestine has proceeded primarily on the pragmatic principle of the quiet establishment of facts on the ground, which the world was to ultimately come to accept. It has been a highly successful policy. There is every reason to expect it to persist as long as the United States provides the necessary military, economic, diplomatic, and ideological support. For those concerned with the rights of the brutalized Palestinians, there can be no higher priority than working to change U.S. policies, not an idle dream by any means. Chapter 17. The U.S. is a leading terrorist state. Imagine that the lead article in Pravda reported a study by the KGB reviewing major terrorist operations run by the Kremlin around the world in an effort to determine the factors that led to their success or failure. Its final conclusion: unfortunately, successes were rare, so some rethinking of policy is in order. Suppose that the article went on to quote Vladimir Putin as saying that he had asked the KGB to carry out such inquiries in order to find cases of financing and supplying arms to an insurgency in a country that actually worked out well. And they couldn't come up with much. So he has some reluctance about continuing such efforts. If, almost unimaginably, such an article were to appear, cries of outrage and indignation would rise to the heavens, and Russia would be bitterly condemned, or worse, not only for the vicious terrorist record it had openly acknowledged, but for the reaction among the leadership and the political class, no concern, except for how well Russian state terrorism works and whether the practices can be improved. It is indeed hard to imagine that such an article might appear, except for the fact that it recently did, almost. On October 14, 2014, the lead story in the New York Times reported a study by the CIA reviewing major terrorist operations run by the White House around the world in an effort to determine the factors that led to their success or failure, with the very conclusion mentioned above. The article went on to quote President Obama as saying that he had asked the CIA to carry out such an inquiry in order to find cases of financing and supplying arms to an insurgency in a country that actually worked out well. And they couldn't come up with much. So he did indeed have some reluctance about continuing such efforts. There were no cries of outrage, no indignation, nothing. The conclusion seems quite clear. In Western political culture, it is taken to be entirely natural and appropriate that the leader of the free world should be a terrorist rogue state and should openly proclaim its eminence in such crimes. And it is only natural and appropriate that the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and liberal constitutional lawyer who holds the reins of power should be concerned only with how to carry out such actions more efficaciously. A closer look establishes these conclusions quite firmly. The article opens by citing U.S. operations from Angola to Nicaragua to Cuba. Let us add a little of what is omitted, drawing from the groundbreaking studies of Cuba's role in the liberation of Africa by Piero Gleijeses, notably in his recent book Visions of Freedom. In Angola, the United States joined South Africa in providing the crucial support for Jonas Savimbi's terrorist UNITA army. It continued to do so even after Savimbi had been roundly defeated in a carefully monitored free election and South Africa had withdrawn support from this monster whose lust for power had brought appalling misery to his people, in the words of British Ambassador to Angola Marat Golding, a statement seconded by the CIA station chief in neighboring Kinshasa. The CIA official warned that it wasn't a good idea to support the monster because of the extent of Savimbi's crimes. He was terribly brutal. Despite extensive and murderous US-backed terrorist operations in Angola, Cuban forces drove South African aggressors out of the country, compelled them to leave illegally occupied Namibia, and opened the way for the Angolan election in which, after his defeat, Savimbi dismissed entirely the views of nearly 800 foreign elections observers here that the balloting was generally free and fair, as the New York Times reported, and continued the terrorist war with US support. Cuban achievements in the liberation of Africa and the ending of apartheid were hailed by Nelson Mandela when he was finally released from prison. Among his first acts was to declare that during all my years in prison, Cuba was an inspiration and Fidel Castro a tower of strength. Cuban victories destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor and inspired the fighting masses of South Africa, a turning point for the liberation of our continent and of my people from the scourge of apartheid. What other country can point to a record of greater selflessness than Cuba has displayed in its relations to Africa? The terrorist commander Henry Kissinger, in contrast, was apoplectic over the insubordination of the pipsqueak Castro, whom he felt should be smash-ed, as William Leo Grande and Peter Kornblue reported in their book BAFK Channel to Cuba, relying on recently declassified documents. Turning to Nicaragua, we need not tarry on Ronald Reagan's terrorist war, which continued well after the International Court of Justice ordered Washington to cease its illegal use of force, that is, international terrorism, and pay substantial reparations, and after a resolution of the UN Security Council that called on all states, meaning the United States, to observe international law vetoed by Washington. It should be acknowledged, however, that Reagan's terrorist war against Nicaragua, extended by George H.W. Bush, the statesman Bush, was not as destructive as the state terrorism he enthusiastically backed in El Salvador and Guatemala. Nicaragua had the advantage of having an army to confront the US-run terrorist forces, while in the neighboring states the terrorists assaulting the population were the security forces armed and trained by Washington. In Cuba, Washington's terror operations were launched in full fury by President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to punish Cubans for defeating the US-run Bay of Pigs invasion. This terrorist war was no small affair. It involved 400 Americans, 2,000 Cubans, a private navy of fast boats, and a $50 million annual budget. It was run in part by a Miami CIA station functioning in violation of the Neutrality Act and, presumably, the law banning CIA operations in the United States. Operations included the bombing of hotels and industrial installations, the sinking of fishing boats, the poisoning of crops and livestock, the contamination of sugar exports, and so on. Some of these operations were not specifically authorized by the CIA but were carried out by the terrorist forces it funded and supported, a distinction without a difference in the case. As has since been revealed, the terrorist war, Operation Mongoose, was a factor in Khrushchev's sending of missiles to Cuba and the missile crisis, which came ominously close to a terminal nuclear war. U.S. operations in Cuba were no trivial matter. some attention has been paid to just one rather minor part of the terror war: the many attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, generally dismissed as childish CIA shenanigans. Apart from that, none of what happened has elicited much interest or commentary. The first serious English-language inquiry into the impact of the terror war on Cubans was published in 2010 by Canadian researcher Keith Bollender, in his Voices from the Other Side, a valuable study that has largely been ignored. The three examples highlighted in the New York Times report on U.S. terrorism are only the tip of the iceberg. Nevertheless, it is useful to have this prominent acknowledgement of Washington's dedication to murderous and destructive terror operations and of the insignificance of all of this to the political class, which accepts it as normal and proper that the U.S. should be a terrorist superpower, immune to law and civilized norms. Oddly, the world may not agree. Global polls show that the United States is regarded as the biggest threat to world peace by a very large margin. Fortunately, Americans were spared this insignificant information. Chapter 18. Obama's historic move. The establishment of diplomatic ties between the United States and Cuba has been widely hailed as an event of historic importance. Correspondent John Lee Anderson, who has written perceptively about the region, sums up a general reaction among liberal intellectuals when he writes, in The New Yorker, that Barack Obama has shown that he can act as a statesman of historic heft. And so, at this moment, has Raúl Castro. For Cubans, this moment will be emotionally cathartic as well as historically transformational. Their relationship with their wealthy, powerful Northern American neighbor has remained frozen in the 1960s for 50 years. To a surreal degree, their destinies have been frozen as well. For Americans, this is important, too. Peace with Cuba takes us momentarily back to that golden time when the United States was a beloved nation throughout the world, when a young and handsome JFK was in office, before Vietnam, before Allende, before Iraq and all the other miseries, and allows us to feel proud about ourselves for finally doing the right thing. The past is not quite as idyllic as portrayed in the persistent Camelot image. JFK was not before Vietnam, or even before Allende and Iraq, but let us put that aside. In Vietnam, when JFK entered office, the brutality of the no-din-diem regime that the United States had imposed had finally elicited domestic resistance that it could not control. Kennedy therefore at once escalated the U.S. intervention to outright aggression, ordering the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam, under South Vietnamese markings, which deceived no one, authorizing napalm and chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, and launching programs to drive peasants into virtual concentration camps to protect them from the guerrillas whom Washington knew they were mostly supporting. By 1963, reports from the ground seemed to indicate that Kennedy's war was succeeding, but a serious problem arose. In August, the administration learned that the Diem government was seeking negotiations with North Vietnam to end the conflict. If JFK had had the slightest intention to withdraw, that would have been a perfect opportunity to do so gracefully, with no political cost. He could even have claimed, in the usual style, that it was American fortitude and its principled defense of freedom that had compelled the North Vietnamese to surrender. Instead, Washington backed a military coup to install in power hawkish generals more attuned to JFK's actual commitments. President Diem and his brother were murdered in the process. With victory apparently within sight, Kennedy reluctantly accepted a proposal by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to begin withdrawing troops, National Security Action Memo 263, but only with a crucial proviso: after victory had been attained. Kennedy maintained that demand insistently until his assassination a few weeks later. Many illusions have been concocted about these events, but they collapse quickly under the weight of the rich documentary record. The story elsewhere was also not quite as idyllic as in the Camelot legends. One of the most consequential of Kennedy's decisions, in 1962, was to shift the mission of Latin American militaries from hemispheric defense to internal security, with horrendous consequences for the hemisphere. Those who do not prefer what international relations specialist Michael Glennon has called intentional ignorance can easily fill in the details. In Cuba, Kennedy inherited Eisenhower's policy of embargo and formal plans to overthrow the regime, and he quickly escalated them with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The failure of the invasion caused near hysteria in Washington. At the first cabinet meeting after the failed invasion, the atmosphere was almost savage, Under Secretary of State Chester Bowles noted privately. There was an almost frantic reaction for an action program. Kennedy articulated the hysteria in his public pronouncements, though he was aware, as he said privately, that allies think that we're slightly demented on the subject of Cuba. Not without reason. Kennedy's actions were true to his words. There is now much debate about whether Cuba should be removed from the list of states supporting terrorism. Such a question can only bring to mind the words of Tacitus that crime once exposed had no refuge but in audacity. Except that it is not exposed, thanks to the treason of the intellectuals. On taking office after Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon Johnson relaxed the reign of terror, which nonetheless continued through the 1990s. But he was not about to allow Cuba to survive in peace. He explained to Senator William Fulbright that though I'm not getting into any Bay of Pigs deal, he wanted advice about what we ought to do to pinch their nuts more than we're doing. Latin America historian Lars Schultz observes that nut pinching has been U.S. policy ever since. Some, to be sure, have felt that such delicate means are not enough. Take for example Richard Nixon's cabinet member Alexander Haig, who asked the president to just give me the word and I'll turn that island into a parking lot. His eloquence captured vividly the long-standing frustration in Washington about that infernal little Cuban republic, Theodore Roosevelt's phrase as he ranted in fury over Cuban unwillingness to accept graciously the invasion of 1898 that would block their liberation from Spain and turn them into a virtual colony. Surely his courageous ride up San Juan Hill had been in a noble cause. Overlooked, commonly, is that African American battalions were largely responsible for conquering the hill. Historian Luis Perez writes that the intervention, hailed at home as a humanitarian act to liberate Cuba, achieved its actual objectives. A Cuban War of Liberation was transformed into a U.S. War of Conquest, the Spanish-American War, in imperial nomenclature, designed to obscure a Cuban victory that was quickly aborted by the invasion. The outcome relieved American anxieties about what was anathema to all North American policymakers since Thomas Jefferson, Cuban independence. How things have changed in 2 centuries. There have been tentative efforts to improve relations in the past 50 years, reviewed in detail by William Leo Grande and Peter Kornblue in BAFK Channel to Cuba. Whether we should feel proud about ourselves for the steps that Obama has taken may be debated, but they are the right thing, even though the crushing embargo remains in place in defiance of the entire world, Israel excepted, and tourism is still barred. In his address to the nation announcing the new policy, the president made it clear that in other respects, too, the punishment of Cuba for refusing to bend to U.S. will and violence will continue, repeating pretexts that are too ludicrous for comment. Worthy of attention, however, are these words of the president: "Proudly, the United States has supported democracy and human rights in Cuba through these 5 decades. We've done so primarily through policies that aim to isolate the island, preventing the most basic travel and commerce that Americans can enjoy anyplace else. And though this policy has been rooted in the best of intentions, no other nation joins us in imposing these sanctions, and it has had little effect beyond providing the Cuban government with a rationale for restrictions on its people. Today, I'm being honest with you. We can never erase the history between us." One has to admire the stunning audacity of this pronouncement, which again recalls the words of Tacitus. Obama is surely not unaware of the actual history, which includes not only the murderous terrorist war and scandalous economic embargo, but also the military occupation of southeastern Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, including the country's major port, despite requests by the government since independence to return what was stolen at gunpoint, a policy justified only by a fanatic commitment to block Cuba's economic development. By comparison, Putin's illegal takeover of Crimea looks almost benign. dedication to revenge against the impudent Cubans who resist U.S. domination has been so extreme that it has even overruled the wishes of powerful segments of the business community for normalization, pharmaceuticals, agribusiness, energy, and unusual development in U.S. foreign policy. Washington's cruel and vindictive policies have virtually isolated the country in the hemisphere and elicited contempt and ridicule throughout the world. Washington and its acolytes like to pretend that they have been isolating Cuba, as Obama intoned, but the record shows clearly that it is the United States that has been isolated, probably the primary reason for the partial change of course. Domestic opinion, no doubt, is also a factor in Obama's historic move, though the public has been in favor of normalization for a long time. A CNN poll in 2014 showed that only a quarter of Americans now regard Cuba as a serious threat to the United States, as compared with over two-thirds 30 years earlier, when President Reagan was warning about the grave threat to our lives posed by the nutmeg capital of the world, Grenada, and by the Nicaraguan army, only 2 days' march from Texas. With those fears now having somewhat abated, perhaps we can slightly relax our vigilance. In the extensive commentary on Obama's decision, a leading theme has been that Washington's benign efforts to bring democracy and human rights to suffering Cubans, sullied only by childish CIA shenanigans, have been a failure. Our lofty goals were not achieved, so a reluctant change of course is finally in order. Were the policies a failure? That depends on what the goal was. The answer is quite clear in the documentary record. The Cuban threat was the familiar one that runs through Cold War history. It was spelled out clearly by the incoming Kennedy administration. The primary concern was that Cuba might be a virus that would spread contagion. As historian Thomas Patterson observes, Cuba, as symbol and reality, challenged U.S. hegemony in Latin America. The way to deal with a virus is to kill it and inoculate any potential victims. That sensible policy is just what Washington pursued, quite successfully. Cuba has survived, but without the ability to achieve its feared potential. And the region was inoculated with vicious military dictatorships, beginning with the Kennedy-inspired military coup that established a terror and torture regime in Brazil shortly after Kennedy's assassination. The generals had carried out a democratic rebellion. Ambassador Lincoln Gordon cabled home. The revolution was a great victory for free world, which prevented a total loss to west of all South American republics and should create a greatly improved climate for private investments. This democratic revolution was the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century, Gordon held, one of the major turning points in world history in this period, which removed what Washington saw as a Castro clone. Much the same was true of the Vietnam War, also considered a failure and a defeat. Vietnam itself was of no particular concern, but as the documentary record reveals, Washington was concerned that successful independent development there might spread contagion throughout the region. Vietnam was virtually destroyed, it would be a model for no one. And the region would be protected by installing murderous dictatorships, much as in Latin America in the same years. It is not unnatural that imperial policy should follow similar lines in different parts of the world. The Vietnam War is described as a failure, an American defeat. In reality, it was a partial victory. The United States did not achieve its maximal goal of turning Vietnam into the Philippines, but the major concerns were overcome, much as in the case of Cuba. Such outcomes therefore count as defeat, failure, terrible decisions. The imperial mentality is wondrous to behold. Chapter 19. 2 ways about it. In the wake of the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo, which killed 12 people including the editor and 4 other cartoonists, and the murder of 4 Jews at a kosher supermarket shortly after, French Prime Minister Manuel Valls declared a war against terrorism, against jihadism, against radical Islam, against everything that is aimed at breaking fraternity, freedom, solidarity. Millions of people demonstrated in condemnation of the atrocities, amplified by a chorus of horror under the banner "I am Charlie." There were eloquent pronouncements of outrage, captured well by the head of Israel's Labor Party, Isaac Herzog, who declared that terrorism is terrorism. There's no 2 ways about it, and that all the nations that seek peace and freedom face, an enormous challenge from brutal violence. The crimes also elicited a flood of commentary, inquiring into the roots of these shocking assaults in Islamic culture and exploring ways to counter the murderous wave of Islamic terrorism without sacrificing our values. The New York Times described the assault as a clash of civilizations, but was corrected by Times columnist Anand Giridharadas, who tweeted that it was not and never a war of civilizations or between them, but a war for civilization against groups on the other side of that line. The scene in Paris was described vividly in the New York Times by veteran Europe correspondent Stephen Erlanger: a day of sirens, helicopters in the air, frantic news bulletins, of police cordons and anxious crowds, of young children led away from schools to safety. It was a day, like the previous two, of blood and horror in and around Paris. Erlanger also quoted a surviving journalist, who said, "Everything crashed. There was no way out. There was smoke everywhere. It was terrible. People were screaming. It was like a nightmare." Another reported a huge detonation, and everything went completely dark. The scene, Erlanger reported, was an increasingly familiar one of smashed glass, broken walls, twisted timbers, scorched paint, and emotional devastation. The quotes in the previous paragraph, however, as independent journalist David Peterson reminds us, are not from January 2015. Rather, they are from a report Erlanger wrote on April 24, 1999, which received far less attention. Erlanger was reporting on the NATO missile attack on Serbian state television headquarters that knocked Radio Television of Serbia, RTS, off the air, killing 16 journalists. NATO and American officials defended the attack, Erlanger reported, as an effort to undermine the regime of President Slobodan Milosevic of Yugoslavia. Pentagon spokesman Kenneth Bacon told a briefing in Washington that Serb TV is as much a part of Milosevic's murder machine as his military is, hence a legitimate target of attack. At the time, there were no demonstrations or cries of outrage, no chants of "We are RTS," no inquiries into the roots of the attack in Christian culture and history. On the contrary, the attack on the TV headquarters was lauded. The highly regarded diplomat Richard Holbrooke, then special envoy to Yugoslavia, described the successful attack on RTS as an enormously important and, I think, positive development. There are many other events that call for no inquiry into Western culture and history, for example, the worst single terrorist atrocity in Europe in recent years, when Anders Breivik, a Christian ultra-Zionist extremist and Islamophobe, slaughtered 77 people, mostly teenagers, in July 2011. Also ignored in the war against terrorism is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, Obama's global drone assassination campaign, targeting people suspected of perhaps intending to harm us someday and any unfortunates who happen to be nearby. Other unfortunates are also not lacking, such as the 50 civilians killed in a US-led bombing raid in Syria in December, barely reported. One person was indeed punished in connection with the NATO attack on RTS. A Serbian court sentenced Dragoljub Milanovic, general manager of Radio Television of Serbia, to 10 years in prison for failing to evacuate the building. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia considered the NATO attack, concluding that it was not a crime, and although civilian casualties were unfortunately high, they do not appear to be clearly disproportionate. The comparison between these cases helps us understand the condemnation of the New York Times by civil rights lawyer Floyd Abrams, famous for his forceful defense of freedom of expression. "There are times for self-restraint," Abrams wrote, but in the immediate wake of the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory, the Times editors would have served the cause of free expression best by engaging in it, that is, by publishing the Charlie Hebdo cartoons ridiculing Muhammad that elicited the assault. Abrams is right in describing the Charlie Hebdo attack as the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory. The reason has to do with the concept living memory, a category carefully constructed to include their crimes against us while scrupulously excluding our crimes against them, the latter not crimes but a noble defense of the highest values, sometimes inadvertently flawed. There are many other illustrations of the interesting category living memory. One is provided by the marine assault against Fallujah in November 2004, one of the worst crimes of the US-UK invasion of Iraq. The assault opened with the occupation of Fallujah General Hospital, a major war crime quite apart from how it was carried out. The crime was reported prominently on the front page of the New York Times, accompanied by a photograph depicting how patients and hospital employees were rushed out of rooms by armed soldiers and ordered to sit or lie on the floor while troops tied their hands behind their backs. The occupation of the hospital was considered meritorious and justified, since it shut down what officers said was a propaganda weapon for the militants, Fallujah General Hospital, with its stream of reports of civilian casualties. Evidently, shutting down this propaganda weapon was no assault on free expression, and does not qualify for entry into living memory. There are other questions. One would naturally ask how France upholds freedom of expression, for example, by the Gaysot law repeatedly implemented, which effectively grants the state the right to determine historical truth and punish deviation from its edicts. Or how it upholds the sacred principles of fraternity, freedom, solidarity by expelling miserable descendants of Holocaust survivors, the Roma, to bitter persecution in Eastern Europe, or by its deplorable treatment of North African immigrants in the banlieues of Paris, where the Charlie Hebdo terrorists became jihadis. Anyone with eyes open will quickly notice other rather striking omissions from living memory. Ignored, for instance, is the assassination of 3 journalists in Latin America in December 2014, bringing the number for the year to 31. There have been dozens of journalists murdered in Honduras alone since the military coup of 2009 that was effectively authorized by the United States, probably according post-coup Honduras the per capita championship when it comes to the murder of journalists. But again, this was not an assault on freedom of the press within living memory. These few examples illustrate a very general principle observed with impressive dedication and consistency. The more we can blame some crimes on enemies, the greater the outrage, the greater our responsibility for crimes, and hence the more we can do to end them, the less the concern, tending to oblivion. Contrary to the eloquent pronouncements, it is not the case that terrorism is terrorism. There's no two ways about it. There definitely are two ways about it, theirs versus ours. And not just when it comes to terrorism. Chapter 20. One day in the life of a reader of the New York Times. The New York Times can plausibly be regarded as the world's leading newspaper. It is an indispensable source of news and commentary, but there is a lot more that one can learn by reading it carefully and critically. Let us keep to a single day, April 6, 2015, though almost any other day would have provided similar insights into prevailing ideology and intellectual culture. A front-page article is devoted to a flawed story about a campus rape in Rolling Stone magazine, exposed in the Columbia Journalism Review. So severe is this departure from journalistic integrity that it is also the subject of the lead story in the business section, with a full inside page devoted to the continuation of the 2 reports. The shocked reports refer to several past crimes of the press, a few cases of fabrication, quickly exposed, and cases of plagiarism, too numerous to list. The specific crime of Rolling Stone is lack of skepticism, which is in many ways the most insidious of the 3 categories. It is refreshing to see the commitment of the Times to the integrity of journalism. On page 7 of the same issue, there is an important story by Thomas Fuller headlined "One Woman's Mission to Free Laos from Millions of Unexploded Bombs." It reports on the single-minded effort of a Lao American woman, Chanafa Kamvongsa, to rid her native land of millions of bombs still buried there, the legacy of a 9-year American air campaign that made Laos one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth. The story notes that as a result of Ms. Kamvongsa's lobbying, the United States increased its annual spending on the removal of unexploded bombs by a munificent $12 million. The most lethal are cluster bombs, which are designed to cause maximum casualties to troops by spraying hundreds of bomblets onto the ground. About 30% remain unexploded, so that they kill and maim children who pick up the pieces, farmers who strike them while working, and other unfortunates. An accompanying map features Siêng Kuang province in northern Laos, better known as the Plain of Jars, the primary target of the intensive bombing, which reached its peak of fury in 1969. Fuller reports that Ms. Kamvangsa was spurred into action when she came across a collection of drawings of the bombings made by refugees and collected by Fred Branfman, an anti-war activist who helped expose the secret war. The drawings appear in his remarkable book Voices from the Plain of Jars, published in 1972 and republished by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2013 with a new introduction. The drawings vividly display the torment of the victims, poor peasants in a remote area that had virtually nothing to do with the Vietnam War, as officially conceded. One typical report by a 26-year-old nurse captures the nature of the air war. There wasn't a night when we thought we'd live until morning, never a morning we thought we'd survive until night. Did our children cry? Oh, yes, and we did also. I just stayed in my cave. I didn't see the sunlight for 2 years. What did I think about? Oh, I used to repeat, please don't let the planes come, please don't let the planes come, please don't let the planes come. Branfman's valiant efforts did indeed bring some awareness of this hideous atrocity. His assiduous research also unearthed the reasons for the savage destruction of a helpless peasant society. He exposed them once again in the introduction to the new edition of Voices. One of the most shattering revelations about the bombing was discovering why it had so vastly increased in 1969, as described by the refugees. I learned that after President Lyndon Johnson had declared a bombing halt over North Vietnam in November 1968, he had simply diverted the planes into northern Laos. There was no military reason for doing so. It was simply because, as U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission Monteagle Stearns testified to the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations in October 1969, well, we had all those planes sitting around and couldn't just let them stay there with nothing to do. Therefore, the unused planes were unleashed on poor peasants, devastating the peaceful Plain of Jars, far from the ravages of Washington's murderous wars of aggression in Indochina. Let us now see how these revelations are transmuted into New York Times newspeak. Writes Fuller, the targets were North Vietnamese troops, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a large part of which passed through Laos, as well as North Vietnam's Laotian communist allies. Compare this to the words of the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission and the heartrending drawings and testimony in Fred Branfman's book. True, the Times reporter has a source, U.S. propaganda. That surely suffices to overwhelm mere facts about one of the major crimes of the post-World War II era, as detailed in the very source he cites, Fred Branfman's crucial revelations. We can be confident that this colossal lie in the service of the state will not merit lengthy exposure and denunciation of disgraceful misdeeds of the free press such as plagiarism and lack of skepticism. The same issue of the New York Times treats us to a report by the inimitable Thomas Friedman, earnestly relaying the words of President Obama, presenting what Friedman labels the Obama doctrine. Every president has to have a doctrine. The profound doctrine is engagement, combined with meeting core strategic needs. The president illustrated his doctrine with a crucial case: you take a country like Cuba. For us to test the possibility that engagement leads to a better outcome for the Cuban people, there aren't that many risks for us. It's a tiny little country. It's not one that threatens our core security interests, and so, there's no reason not to test the proposition. And if it turns out that it doesn't lead to better outcomes, we can adjust our policies. Here the Nobel Peace Laureate expands on his reasons for undertaking what the leading left liberal intellectual journal, the New York Review of Books, hails as the brave and truly historic step of re-establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. It is a move undertaken in order to more effectively empower the Cuban people, the hero explained, our earlier efforts to bring them freedom and democracy having failed to achieve our noble goals. Searching further, we find other gems. There is, for example, a front-page think piece on the Iran nuclear deal by Peter Baker published a few days earlier, warning about the Iranian crimes regularly listed by Washington's propaganda system. All proved to be quite revealing on analysis, though none more so than the ultimate Iranian crime, destabilizing the region by supporting Shiite militias that killed American soldiers in Iraq. Here again is the standard picture. When the United States invades Iraq, virtually destroying it and inciting sectarian conflicts that are tearing the country and now the whole region apart, that counts as stabilization in official and hence media rhetoric. When Iran supports militias resisting the aggression, that is destabilization. And there could hardly be a more heinous crime than killing American soldiers attacking one's home. All of this, and far, far more, makes perfect sense if we show due obedience and uncritically accept approved doctrine. The United States owns the world, and it does so by right, for reasons also explained lucidly in the New York Review of Books in a March 2015 article by Jessica Matthews, former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. American contributions to international security, global economic growth, freedom, and human well-being have been so self-evidently unique and have been so clearly directed to others' benefit that Americans have long believed that the U.S. amounts to a different kind of country. Where others push their national interests, the U.S. tries to advance universal principles. The defense rests. Chapter 21. The Iranian threat: who is the gravest danger to world peace? Throughout the world there is great relief and optimism about the nuclear deal reached in Vienna between Iran and the P5+1 nations, the 5 veto-holding members of the UN Security Council and Germany. Most of the world apparently shares the assessment of the U.S. Arms Control Association that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action establishes a strong and effective formula for blocking all of the pathways by which Iran could acquire material for nuclear weapons for more than a generation and a verification system to promptly detect and deter possible efforts by Iran to covertly pursue nuclear weapons that will last indefinitely. There are, however, striking exceptions to the general enthusiasm: the United States and its closest regional allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia. One consequence of this is that U.S. corporations, much to their chagrin, are prevented from flocking to Tehran along with their European counterparts. Prominent sectors of U.S. power and opinion share the stand of the two regional allies and so are in a state of virtual hysteria over the Iranian threat. Sober commentary in the United States, pretty much across the spectrum, declares that country to be the gravest threat to world peace. Even supporters of the agreement here are wary, given the exceptional gravity of that threat. After all, how can we trust the Iranians, with their terrible record of aggression, violence, disruption, and deceit? Opposition within the political class is so strong that public opinion has shifted quickly from significant support for the deal to an even split. 2 Republicans are almost unanimously opposed to the agreement. The current Republican primaries illustrate the proclaimed reasons. Senator Ted Cruz, considered one of the intellectuals among the crowded field of presidential candidates, warns that Iran may still be able to produce nuclear weapons and could someday use one to set off an electromagnetic pulse that would take down the electrical grid of the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, killing tens of millions of Americans. 2 other candidates, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush and Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, battled over whether to bomb Iran immediately after being elected or after the first cabinet meeting. The one candidate with some foreign policy experience, Lindsey Graham, describes the deal as a death sentence for the state of Israel, which will certainly come as a surprise to Israeli intelligence and strategic analysts, and which Graham knows to be utter nonsense, raising immediate questions about his actual motives for saying so. It is important to bear in mind that the Republicans long ago abandoned the pretense of functioning as a normal parliamentary party. They have, as respected conservative political commentator Norman Ornstein of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute observed, become a radical insurgency that scarcely seeks to participate in normal congressional politics. Since the days of President Ronald Reagan, the party leadership has plunged so far into the pockets of the very rich and the corporate sector that they can attract votes only by mobilizing parts of the population that have not previously been an organized political force. Among them are extremist evangelical Christians, now probably a majority of Republican voters, remnants of the former slaveholding states, nativists who are terrified that they are taking our white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon country away from us, and others who turn the Republican primaries into spectacles remote from the mainstream of modern society, though not from the mainstream of the most powerful country in world history. The departure from global standards, however, goes far beyond the bounds of the Republican radical insurgency. Across the spectrum, there is general agreement with the pragmatic conclusion of General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the Vienna deal does not prevent the United States from striking Iranian facilities if officials decide that it is cheating on the agreement, even though a unilateral military strike is far less likely if Iran behaves. 7 Former Clinton and Obama Middle East negotiator Dennis Ross typically recommends that Iran must have no doubts that if we see it moving towards a weapon that would trigger the use of force even after the termination of the deal, when Iran is free to do what it wants. In fact, the existence of a termination point 15 years hence is, he adds, the greatest single problem with the agreement. He also suggests that the United States provide Israel with B-52 bombers and bunker-busting bombs to protect itself before that terrifying date arrives. The greatest threat. Opponents of the nuclear deal charge that it does not go far enough. Some supporters agree, holding that if the Vienna deal is to mean anything, the whole of the Middle East must rid itself of weapons of mass destruction. The author of those words, Iran's Minister of Foreign Affairs Javad Zarif, added that Iran, in its national capacity and as current chairman of the non-aligned movement, the governments of the large majority of the world's population, is prepared to work with the international community to achieve these goals, knowing full well that, along the way, it will probably run into many hurdles raised by the skeptics of peace and diplomacy. Iran has signed a historic nuclear deal, he continues, and now it is the turn of Israel, the holdout. Israel, of course, is one of the 3 nuclear powers, along with India and Pakistan, whose nuclear weapons programs have been abetted by the United States and who refuse to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Zarif was referring to the regular 5-year NPT review conference, which ended in failure in April when the United States, joined this time by Canada and Great Britain, once again blocked efforts to move toward a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. These efforts have been led by Egypt and other Arab states for 20 years. 2 of the leading figures promoting them at the NPT and other UN agencies, and at the Pugwash conferences, Jayantha Dhanapala and Sergio Duarte, observe that the successful adoption in 1995 of the Resolution on the Establishment of a Zone Free of Weapons of Mass Destruction, WMD, in the Middle East was the main element of a package that permitted the indefinite extension of the NPT. The NPT, in turn, is the most important arms control treaty of all. If it were adhered to, it could end the scourge of nuclear weapons. Repeatedly, implementation of the resolution has been blocked by the United States, most recently by President Obama in 2010 and again in 2015. Dhanapala and Duarte comment that the effort was again blocked on behalf of a state that is not a party to the NPT and is widely believed to be the only one in the region possessing nuclear weapons, a polite and understated reference to Israel. This failure, they hope, will not be the coup de grace to the 2 long-standing NPT objectives of accelerated progress on nuclear disarmament and establishing a Middle Eastern WMD-free zone. Their article, in the Journal of the Arms Control Association, is entitled, "Is There a Future for the NPT?" A nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is a straightforward way to address whatever threat Iran allegedly poses, but a great deal more is at stake in Washington's continuing sabotage of the effort in order to protect its Israeli client. This is not the only case when opportunities to end the alleged Iranian threat have been undermined by Washington, raising further questions about just what is actually at stake. In considering this matter, it is instructive to examine both the unspoken assumptions and the questions that are rarely asked. Let us consider a few of these assumptions, beginning with the most serious, that Iran is the gravest threat to world peace. In the United States, it is a virtual cliché among high officials and commentators that Iran wins that grim prize. There is also a world outside the United States, and although its views are not reported in the mainstream here, perhaps they are of some interest. According to the leading Western polling agencies, Win/Gallup International, the prize for greatest threat is won by the United States, which the world regards as the gravest threat to world peace by a large margin. In second place, far below, is Pakistan, its ranking probably inflated by the Indian vote. Iran is ranked below those two, along with China, Israel, North Korea, and Afghanistan. The world's leading supporter of terrorism. Turning to the next obvious question, what in fact is the Iranian threat? Why, for example, are Israel and Saudi Arabia trembling in fear over the threat of Iran? Whatever the threat is, it can hardly be military. Years ago, U.S. intelligence informed Congress that Iran has very low military expenditures by the standards of the region and that its strategic doctrines are defensive, designed, that is, to deter aggression. This intelligence further reports that it has no evidence Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program and that Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. The authoritative Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, review of global armaments ranks the United States, as usual, far in the lead in military expenditures. China comes in second, with about 1/3 of U.S. expenditures. Far below are Russia and Saudi Arabia, which are nonetheless well above any Western European state. Iran is scarcely mentioned. 15 Full details are provided in an April report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, SIS, which finds a conclusive case that the Arab Gulf states have an overwhelming advantage over Iran in both military spending and access to modern arms. Iran's military spending is a fraction of Saudi Arabia's and far below even the spending of the United Arab Emirates, UAE. Altogether, the Gulf Cooperation Council states of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE outspend Iran on arms by a factor of about 8, an imbalance that goes back decades. 16 The SIS report adds that the Arab Gulf states have acquired and are acquiring some of the most advanced and effective weapons in the world, while Iran has essentially been forced to live in the past, often relying on systems originally delivered at the time of the Shah. In other words, they are virtually obsolete. When it comes to Israel, of course, the imbalance is even greater. Possessing the most advanced U.S. weaponry and a virtual offshore military base for the global superpower, it also has a huge stock of nuclear weapons. To be sure, Israel faces the existential threat of Iranian pronouncements. Supreme Leader Khamenei and former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad famously threatened it with destruction. Except that they didn't, and if they had, it would have been of little moment. They predicted that under God's grace, the Zionist regime will be wiped off the map. According to another translation, Ahmadinejad says Israel must vanish from the page of time, citing a statement by the Ayatollah Khomeini during the period when Israel and Iran were tacitly allied. In other words, they hope that regime change will someday take place. Even that falls far short of the direct calls in both Washington and Tel Aviv for regime change in Iran, not to speak of the actions taken to implement regime change. These, of course, go back to the actual regime change of 1953, when the United States and Britain organized a military coup to overthrow Iran's parliamentary government and install the dictatorship of the Shah, who proceeded to amass one of the world's worst human rights records. These crimes were known to readers of the reports of Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, but not to readers of the U.S. press, which has devoted plenty of space to Iranian human rights violations, but only since 1979, when the Shah's regime was overthrown. The instructive facts are documented carefully in a study by Mansour Farhang and William Dorman. None of this is a departure from the norm. The United States, as is well known, holds the world championship title in regime change, and Israel is no laggard either. The most destructive of its invasions of Lebanon, in 1982, was explicitly aimed at regime change as well as at securing its hold on the occupied territories. The pretexts offered were thin and collapsed at once. That too is not unusual and pretty much independent of the nature of the society, from the laments in the Declaration of Independence about the merciless Indian savages to Hitler's defense of Germany from the wild terror of the Poles. No serious analyst believes that Iran would ever use, or even threaten to use, a nuclear weapon if it had one, and thereby face instant destruction. There is, however, real concern that a nuclear weapon might fall into jihadi hands, not from Iran, where the threat is minuscule, but from U.S. ally Pakistan, where it is very real. In the Journal of the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, two leading Pakistani nuclear scientists, Pervez Hudpoi and Zia Mian, write that increasing fears of militants seizing nuclear weapons or materials and unleashing nuclear terrorism have led to the creation of a dedicated force of over 20,000 troops to guard nuclear facilities. There is no reason to assume, however, that this force would be immune to the problems associated with the units guarding regular military facilities, which have frequently suffered attacks with insider help. In brief, the problem is real, but is displaced to Iran thanks to fantasies concocted for other reasons. Other concerns about the Iranian threat include its role as the world's leading supporter of terrorism, which primarily refers to its support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Both of those movements emerged in resistance to US-backed Israeli violence and aggression, which vastly exceeds anything attributed to these organizations. Whatever one thinks about them, or other beneficiaries of Iranian support, Iran hardly ranks high in support of terror worldwide, even within the Muslim world. Among Islamic states, Saudi Arabia is far in the lead as a sponsor of Islamic terror, not only through direct funding by wealthy Saudis and others in the Gulf, but even more by the missionary zeal with which the Saudis promulgate their extremist Wahhabi Salafi version of Islam through Quranic schools, mosques, clerics, and other means available to a religious dictatorship with enormous oil wealth. ISIS is an extremist offshoot of Saudi religious extremism and its fanning of jihadi flames. In Generation of Islamic Terror, however, nothing can compare with the U.S. war on terror, which has helped to spread the plague from a small tribal area in the Afghanistan-Pakistan borderlands to a vast region from West Africa to Southeast Asia. The invasion of Iraq alone escalated terror attacks by a factor of 7 in the first year, well beyond even what had been predicted by intelligence agencies. Drone warfare against marginalized and oppressed tribal societies also elicits demands for revenge, as ample evidence indicates. Those two Iranian clients, Hezbollah and Hamas, also share the crime of winning the popular vote in the only free elections in the Arab world. Hezbollah is guilty of the even more heinous crime of compelling Israel to withdraw from its occupation of southern Lebanon in violation of Security Council orders dating back decades, an illegal regime of terror punctuated with episodes of extreme violence, murder, and destruction. Fueling instability. Another concern, voiced at the United Nations by U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power, is the instability that Iran fuels beyond its nuclear program. The United States will continue to scrutinize this misbehavior, she declared. In that, she echoed the assurance offered by Defense Secretary Ashton Carter while standing on Israel's northern border that we will continue to help Israel counter Iran's malign influence in supporting Hezbollah, and that the United States reserves the right to use military force against Iran as it deems appropriate. The way Iran fuels instability can be seen particularly dramatically in Iraq, where, among other crimes, it alone came at once to the aid of Kurds defending themselves from the ISIS invasion, and where it is building a $2.5 billion power plant to try to bring electrical power back to its level before the U.S. invasion. Ambassador Power's usage is standard. When the United States invades a country, resulting in hundreds of thousands killed and millions of refugees, along with barbarous torture and destruction that Iraqis compare to the Mongol invasions, leaving Iraq the unhappiest country in the world according to Win/Gallup polls, meanwhile igniting sectarian conflict that is tearing the region to shreds and laying the basis for the ISIS monstrosity along with our Saudi ally, that is stabilization. Iran's shameful actions are fueling instability. The farce of this standard usage sometimes reaches levels that are almost surreal, as when liberal commentator James Chase, former editor of Foreign Affairs, explained that the United States sought to destabilize a freely elected Marxist government in Chile because we were determined to seek stability under the Pinochet dictatorship. Others are outraged that Washington should negotiate at all with a contemptible regime like Iran's, with its horrifying human rights record, and urge instead that we pursue an American-sponsored alliance between Israel and the Sunni states. So writes Leon Wieseltier, contributing editor to the venerable liberal journal The Atlantief, who can barely conceal his visceral hatred for all things Iranian. With a straight face, this respected liberal intellectual recommends that Saudi Arabia, which makes Iran look like a virtual paradise, and Israel, with its vicious crimes in Gaza and elsewhere, should ally to teach that country good behavior. Perhaps the recommendation is not entirely unreasonable when we consider the human rights records of the regimes the United States has imposed and supported throughout the world. Though the Iranian government is no doubt a threat to its own people, it regrettably breaks no records in this regard, and does not descend to the level of favored U.S. allies. That, however, cannot be the concern of Washington, and surely not Tel Aviv or Riyadh. It might also be useful to recall, as surely Iranians do, that not a day has passed since 1953 when the United States was not harming Iranians. As soon as Iranians overthrew the hated U.S.-imposed regime of the Shah in 1979, Washington at once turned to supporting Saddam Hussein's murderous attack on Iran. President Reagan went so far as to deny Saddam's major crime, his chemical warfare assault on Iraq's Kurdish population, which he blamed on Iran instead. When Saddam was tried for crimes under U.S. auspices, that horrendous crime, as well as others in which the United States was complicit, was carefully excluded from the charges, which were restricted to one of his minor crimes, the murder of 148 Shiites in 1982, a footnote to his gruesome record. After the Iran-Iraq War ended, the United States continued to support Saddam Hussein, Iran's primary enemy. President George H.W. Bush even invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production, an extremely serious threat to Iran. Sanctions against Iran were intensified, including against foreign firms dealing with it, and actions were initiated to bar it from the international financial system. In recent years, the hostility has extended to sabotage, the murder of nuclear scientists, presumably by Israel, and cyberwar, openly proclaimed with pride. The Pentagon regards cyberwar as an act of war, justifying a military response, as does NATO, which affirmed in September 2014 that cyber attacks may trigger the collective defense obligations of the NATO powers, when we are the target, that is, not the perpetrators. The prime rogue state. It is only fair to add that there have been breaks in this pattern. President George W. Bush provided several significant gifts to Iran by destroying its major enemies, Saddam Hussein and the Taliban. He even placed Iran's Iraqi enemy under its influence after the U.S. defeat, which was so severe that Washington had to abandon its officially declared goals of establishing permanent military bases, enduring camps, and ensuring that U.S. corporations would have privileged access to Iraq's vast oil resources. Do Iranian leaders intend to develop nuclear weapons today? We can decide for ourselves how credible their denials are, but that they had such intentions in the past is beyond question, since it was asserted openly on the highest authority, which informed foreign journalists that Iran would develop nuclear weapons certainly, and sooner than one thinks. The father of Iran's nuclear energy program and former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was confident that the leadership's plan was to build a nuclear bomb. The CIA also reported that it had no doubt Iran would develop nuclear weapons if neighboring countries did, as they have. All of this was under the Shah, the highest authority just quoted, that is, during the period when high U.S. officials, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Kissinger and others, were urging the Shah to proceed with nuclear programs and pressuring universities to accommodate these efforts. As part of these efforts, my own university, MIT, made a deal with the Shah to admit Iranian students to the nuclear engineering program in return for grants from the Shah, over the very strong objections of the student body, but with comparably strong faculty support, in a meeting that older faculty will doubtless remember well. Asked later why he supported such programs under the Shah but opposed them more recently, Kissinger responded honestly that Iran was an ally then. Putting aside absurdities, what is the real threat of Iran that inspires such fear and fury? A natural place to turn for an answer is, again, U.S. intelligence. Recall its analysis that Iran poses no military threat, that its strategic doctrines are defensive, and that its nuclear programs, with no effort to produce bombs, as far as intelligence can determine, are a central part of its deterrent strategy. Who, then, would be concerned by an Iranian deterrent? The answer is plain: the rogue states that rampage in the region and do not want to tolerate any impediment to their reliance on aggression and violence. In the lead in this regard are the United States and Israel, with Saudi Arabia trying its best to join the club with its invasion of Bahrain, to support the crushing of a reform movement there, and now its murderous assault on Yemen, accelerating a growing humanitarian catastrophe in that country. For the United States, the characterization is familiar. 15 years ago, the prominent political analyst Samuel Huntington warned in the establishment journal Foreign Affairs that for much of the world the United States was becoming the rogue superpower, the single greatest external threat to their societies. Shortly after, his words were echoed by Robert Jervis, the president of the American Political Science Association. In the eyes of much of the world, in fact, the prime rogue state today is the United States. As we have seen, global opinion supports this judgment by a substantial margin. Furthermore, the mantle is worn with pride. That is the clear meaning of the insistence of the leadership and the political class that the United States reserves the right to resort to force if it determines, unilaterally, that Iran is violating some commitment. This policy is of long standing for liberal Democrats, and by no means restricted to Iran. The Clinton Doctrine affirmed that the United States is entitled to resort to the unilateral use of military power even to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, let alone alleged security or humanitarian concerns. Adherence to various versions of this doctrine has been well confirmed in practice, as need hardly be discussed among people willing to look at the facts of current history. These are among the critical matters that should be the focus of attention in analyzing the nuclear deal at Vienna. Chapter 22: The Doomsday Clock. In January 2015, the Bulletin of the Atomy FS scientists advanced its famous doomsday clock to 3 minutes before midnight, a threat level that had not been reached for 30 years. The Bulletin's statement explaining this advance toward catastrophe invoked the two major threats to survival: nuclear weapons and unchecked climate change. The call condemned world leaders, who have failed to act with the speed or on the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe, endangering every person on Earth, by failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization. Since then, there has been good reason to consider moving the hands even closer to doomsday. As the year ended, world leaders met in Paris to address the severe problem of unchecked climate change. Hardly a day passes without new evidence of how severe the crisis is. To pick almost at random, shortly before the opening of the Paris conference, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab released a study that both surprised and alarmed scientists who have been studying Arctic ice. The study showed that a huge Greenland glacier, Zacharias Istrom, broke loose from a glaciologically stable position in 2012 and entered a phase of accelerated retreat, an unexpected and ominous development. The glacier holds enough water to raise global sea level by more than 18 inches, 46 centimeters, if it were to melt completely. And now it's on a crash diet, losing 5 billion tons of mass every year. All the ice is crumbling into the North Atlantic Ocean. Yet there was little expectation that world leaders in Paris would act with the speed or on the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe. And even if by some miracle they had, it would have been of limited value, for reasons that should be deeply disturbing. When the agreement was approved in Paris, French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who hosted the talks, announced that it is legally binding. That may be the hope, but there are more than a few obstacles that are worthy of careful attention. In all of the extensive media coverage of the Paris conference, perhaps the most important sentences are these, buried near the end of a long New York Times analysis. Traditionally, negotiators have sought to forge a legally binding treaty that needed ratification by the governments of the participating countries to have force. There is no way to get that in this case, because of the United States. A treaty would be dead on arrival on Capitol Hill without the required two-thirds majority vote in the Republican-controlled Senate. So the voluntary plans are taking the place of mandatory, top-down targets. And voluntary plans are a guarantee of failure. Because of the United States. More precisely, because of the Republican Party, which by now is becoming a real danger to decent human survival. The conclusions are underscored in another Times piece on the Paris Agreement. At the end of a long story lauding the achievement, the article notes that the system created at the conference depends heavily on the views of the future world leaders who will carry out those policies. In the United States, every Republican candidate running for president in 2016 has publicly questioned or denied the science of climate change, and has voiced opposition to Mr. Obama's climate change policies. In the Senate, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, who has led the charge against Mr. Obama's climate change agenda, said, before his international partners pop the champagne, they should remember that this is an unattainable deal based on a domestic energy plan that is likely illegal, that half the states have sued to halt, and that Congress has already voted to reject. Both parties have moved to the right during the neoliberal period of the past generation. Mainstream Democrats are now pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Meanwhile, the Republican Party has largely drifted off the spectrum, becoming what respected conservative political analyst Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein call a radical insurgency that has virtually abandoned normal parliamentary politics. With the rightward drift, the Republican Party's dedication to wealth and privilege has become so extreme that its actual policies could not attract voters, so it has had to seek a new popular base, mobilized on other grounds: evangelical Christians who await the second coming, nativists who fear that they are taking our country away from us, unreconstructed racists, people with real grievances who gravely mistake their causes, and others like them who are easy prey to demagogues and can readily become a radical insurgency. In recent years, the Republican establishment had managed to suppress the voices of the base that it has mobilized. But no longer. By the end of 2015, the establishment was expressing considerable dismay and desperation over its inability to do so, as the Republican base and its choices fell out of control. Republican elected officials and contenders for the next presidential election expressed open contempt for the Paris deliberations, refusing to even attend the proceedings. The three candidates who led in the polls at the time, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Ben Carson, adopted the stand of the largely evangelical base: humans have no impact on global warming, if it is happening at all. The other candidates reject government action to deal with the matter. Immediately after Obama spoke in Paris, pledging that the United States would be in the vanguard seeking global action, the Republican-dominated Congress voted to scuttle his recent Environmental Protection Agency rules to cut carbon emissions. As the press reported, this was a provocative message to more than 100 world leaders that the American president does not have the full support of his government on climate policy, a bit of an understatement. Meanwhile, Lamar Smith, Republican head of the House's Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, carried forward his jihad against government scientists who dare to report the facts. The message is clear. American citizens face an enormous responsibility right at home. A companion story in the New York Times reports that 2/3 of Americans support the United States joining a binding international agreement to curb growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And by a 5-3 margin, Americans regard the climate as more important than the economy. But it doesn't matter. Public opinion is dismissed. That fact, once again, sends a strong message to Americans. It is their task to cure the dysfunctional political system, in which popular opinion is a marginal factor. The disparity between public opinion and policy, in this case, has significant implications for the fate of the world. We should, of course, have no illusions about a past golden age. Nevertheless, the developments just reviewed constitute significant changes. The undermining of functioning democracy is one of the contributions of the neoliberal assault on the world's population in the past generation. And this is not happening just in the US. In Europe, the impact may be even worse. Let us turn to the other, and traditional, concern of the atomic scientists who adjust the doomsday clock: nuclear weapons. The current threat of nuclear war amply justifies their January 2015 decision to advance the clock 2 minutes toward midnight. What has happened since reveals the growing threat even more clearly, a matter that elicits insufficient concern, in my opinion. The last time the doomsday clock reached 3 minutes before midnight was in 1983, at the time of the Able Archer exercises of the Reagan administration. These exercises simulated attacks on the Soviet Union to test their defense systems. Recently released Russian archives reveal that the Russians were deeply concerned by the operations and were preparing to respond, which would have meant, simply, the end. We have learned more about these rash and reckless exercises, and about how close the world was to disaster, from U.S. military and intelligence analyst Melvin Goodman, who was CIA division chief and senior analyst at the Office of Soviet Affairs at the time. In addition to the Able Archer mobilization exercise that alarmed the Kremlin, Goodman writes, the Reagan administration authorized unusually aggressive military exercises near the Soviet border that, in some cases, violated Soviet territorial sovereignty. The Pentagon's risky measures included sending U.S. strategic bombers over the North Pole to test Soviet radar, and naval exercises in wartime approaches to the USSR where U.S. warships had previously not entered. Additional secret operations simulated surprise naval attacks on Soviet targets. We now know that the world was saved from likely nuclear destruction in those frightening days by the decision of a Russian officer, Stanislav Petrov, not to transmit to higher authorities the report of automated detection systems that the USSR was under missile attack. Accordingly, Petrov takes his place alongside Russian submarine commander Vasily Arkhipov, who, at a dangerous moment of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, refused to authorize the launching of nuclear torpedoes when the subs were under attack by U.S. destroyers enforcing a quarantine. Other recently revealed examples enrich the already frightening record. Nuclear security expert Bruce Blair reports that the closest the U.S. came to an inadvertent strategic launch decision by the president happened in 1979, when a NORAD early warning training tape depicting a full-scale Soviet strategic strike inadvertently coursed through the actual early warning network. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was called twice in the night and told the U.S. was under attack, and he was just picking up the phone to persuade President Carter that a full-scale response needed to be authorized right away, when a third call told him it was a false alarm. This newly revealed example brings to mind a critical incident of 1995, when the trajectory of a U.S. Norwegian rocket carrying scientific equipment resembled the path of a nuclear missile. This elicited Russian concerns that quickly reached President Boris Yeltsin, who had to decide whether to launch a nuclear strike. Blair adds other examples from his own experience. In one case, at the time of the 1967 Middle East War, a carrier nuclear aircraft crew was sent an actual attack order instead of an exercise/training nuclear order. A few years later, in the early 1970s, the Strategic Air Command in Omaha retransmitted an exercise launch order as an actual real-world launch order. In both cases, code checks had failed. Human intervention prevented the launch. But you get the drift here, Blair adds. It just wasn't that rare for these kinds of snafus to occur. Blair made these comments in reaction to a report by Airman John Borden that has only recently been cleared by the U.S. Air Force. Borden was serving on the U.S. military base in Okinawa in October 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and a moment of serious tensions in Asia as well. The U.S. nuclear alert system had been raised to DEFCON 2, one level below DEFCON 1, when nuclear missiles can be launched immediately. At the peak of the crisis, on October 28, a missile crew received authorization to launch its nuclear missiles, in error. They decided not to, averting likely nuclear war and joining Petrov and Arkhipov in the pantheon of men who decided to disobey protocol and thereby saved the world. As Blair observed, such incidents are not uncommon. One recent expert study found dozens of false alarms every year during the period reviewed, 1977 to 1983. The study concluded that the range is 43 to 255 per year. The author of the study, Seth Baum, summarizes with appropriate words, "Nuclear war is the black swan we can never see, except in that brief moment when it is killing us. We delay eliminating the risk at our own peril." Now is the time to address the threat, because now we are still alive. These reports, like those of Eric Schlosser's extensive review command and control, keep mostly to US systems. The Russian ones are doubtless much more error-prone. That is not to mention the extreme danger posed by the systems of others, notably Pakistan. Sometimes the threat has not been accident, but adventurism, as in the case of Able Archer. The most extreme case was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the threat of disaster was all too real. The way it was handled is shocking, so is the manner in which it is commonly interpreted, as we have seen. With this grim record in mind, it is useful to look at strategic debates and planning. One chilling case is the Clinton-era 1995 Stratcom study Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. The study calls for retaining the right of first strike, even against non-nuclear states. It explains that nuclear weapons are constantly used, in the sense that they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. It also urges a national persona of irrationality and vindictiveness to intimidate the world. Current doctrine is explored in the lead article in the journal International Security, one of the most authoritative in the domain of strategic doctrine. The authors explain that the United States is committed to strategic primacy, that is, insulation from retaliatory strike. This is the logic behind Obama's new triad, strengthening submarine and land-based missiles and the bomber force, along with missile defense to counter a retaliatory strike. The concern raised by the authors is that the U.S. demand for strategic primacy might induce China to react by abandoning its no first use policy and by expanding its limited deterrent. The authors think that they will not, but the prospect remains uncertain. Clearly, the doctrine enhances the dangers in a tense and conflicted region. The same is true of NATO expansion to the east in violation of verbal promises made to Mikhail Gorbachev when the USSR was collapsing and he agreed to allow a unified Germany to become part of NATO. Quite a remarkable concession when one thinks about the history of the century. Expansion to East Germany took place at once. In the following years, NATO expanded to Russia's borders. There are now substantial threats even to incorporate Ukraine in Russia's geostrategic heartland. 17 can imagine how the United States would react if the Warsaw Pact were still alive. Most of Latin America had joined, and now Mexico and Canada were applying for membership. Aside from that, Russia understands as well as China, and U.S. strategists, for that matter, that the U.S. missile defense systems near Russia's borders are, in effect, a first strike weapon aimed to establish strategic primacy, immunity from retaliation. Perhaps their mission is utterly unfeasible, as some specialists argue. But the targets can never be confident of that. And Russia's militant reactions are quite naturally interpreted by NATO as a threat to the West. One prominent British Ukraine scholar poses what he calls a fateful geographical paradox, that NATO exists to manage the risks created by its existence. The threats are very real right now. Fortunately, the shooting down of a Russian plane by a Turkish F-16 in November 2015 did not lead to an international incident, but it might have, particularly given the circumstances. The plane was on a bombing mission in Syria. It passed for a mere 17 seconds through a fringe of Turkish territory that protrudes into Syria, and evidently was heading for Syria, where it crashed. Shooting it down appears to have been a needlessly reckless and provocative act, and an act with consequences. In reaction, Russia announced that its bombers will henceforth be accompanied by jet fighters and that it is deploying sophisticated anti-aircraft missile systems in Syria. Russia also ordered its missile cruiser Moskva, with its long-range air defense system, to move closer to shore, so that it may be ready to destroy any aerial target posing a potential danger to our aircraft, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced. All of this sets the stage for confrontations that could be lethal. Tensions are also constant at NATO-Russian borders, including military maneuvers on both sides. Shortly after the doomsday clock was moved ominously close to midnight, the national press reported that U.S. military combat vehicles paraded Wednesday through an Estonian city that juts into Russia, a symbolic act that highlighted the stakes for both sides amid the worst tensions between the West and Russia since the Cold War. Shortly before, a Russian warplane came within seconds of colliding with a Danish civilian airliner. Both sides are practicing rapid mobilization and redeployment of forces to the Russian-NATO border, and both believe a war is no longer unthinkable. If that is so, both sides are beyond insanity, since a war might well destroy everything. It has been recognized for decades that a first strike by a major power might destroy the attacker, even without retaliation, simply from the effects of nuclear winter. But that is today's world. And not just today's, that is what we have been living with for 70 years. The reasoning throughout is remarkable. As we have seen, security for the population is typically not a leading concern of policymakers. That has been true from the earliest days of the nuclear age, when in the centers of policy formation there were no efforts, apparently not even expressed thoughts, to eliminate the one serious potential threat to the United States, as might have been possible. And so matters continue to the present, in ways just briefly sampled. That is the world we have been living in, and live in today. Nuclear weapons pose a constant danger of instant destruction, but at least we know in principle how to alleviate the threat, even to eliminate it, an obligation undertaken, and disregarded, by the nuclear powers that have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The threat of global warming is not instantaneous, though it is dire in the longer term and might escalate suddenly. That we have the capacity to deal with it is not entirely clear, but there can be no doubt that the longer the delay, the more extreme the calamity. Prospects for decent long-term survival are not high unless there is a significant change of course. A large share of the responsibility is in our hands, the opportunities as well. Chapter 23, Masters of Mankind. When we ask who rules the world, we commonly adopt the standard convention that the actors in world affairs are states, primarily the great powers, and we consider their decisions and the relations among them. That is not wrong. But we would do well to keep in mind that this level of abstraction can also be highly misleading. States, of course, have complex internal structures, and the choices and decisions of the political leadership are heavily influenced by internal concentrations of power, while the general population is often marginalized. That is true even for the more democratic societies, and obviously for others. We cannot gain a realistic understanding of who rules the world while ignoring the masters of mankind, as Adam Smith called them, in his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, in ours, multinational conglomerates, huge financial institutions, retail empires, and the like. Still following Smith, it is also wise to attend to the vile maxim to which the masters of mankind are dedicated, all for ourselves and nothing for other people, a doctrine known otherwise as bitter and incessant class war, often one-sided, much to the detriment of the people of the home country and the world. In the contemporary global order, the institutions of the masters hold enormous power, not only in the international arena but also within their home states, on which they rely to protect their power and to provide economic support by a wide variety of means. When we consider the role of the masters of mankind, we turn to such state policy priorities of the moment as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the investor rights agreements mislabeled free trade agreements in propaganda and commentary. They are negotiated in secret, apart from the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists writing the crucial details. The intention is to have them adopted in good Stalinist style with fast-track procedures designed to block discussion and allow only the choice of yes or no, hence yes. The designers regularly do quite well, not surprisingly. People are incidental, with the consequences one might anticipate. The second superpower. The neoliberal programs of the past generation have concentrated wealth and power in far fewer hands while undermining functioning democracy, but they have aroused opposition as well, most prominently in Latin America but also in the centers of global power. The European Union (EU), one of the more promising developments of the post-World War II period, has been tottering because of the harsh effect of the policies of austerity during recession, condemned even by the economists of the International Monetary Fund, if not the IMF's political actors. Democracy has been undermined as decision-making shifted to the Brussels bureaucracy, with the northern banks casting their shadow over their proceedings. Mainstream parties have been rapidly losing members to left and to right. The executive director of the Paris-based research group Europa Nova attributes the general disenchantment to a mood of angry impotence as the real power to shape events largely shifted from national political leaders, who, in principle at least, are subject to democratic politics, to the market, the institutions of the European Union and corporations, quite in accord with neoliberal doctrine. Very similar processes are underway in the United States, for somewhat similar reasons, a matter of significance and concern not just for the country but, because of U.S. power for the world. The rising opposition to the neoliberal assault highlights another crucial aspect of the Standard Convention. It sets aside the public, which often fails to accept the approved role of spectators, rather than participants, assigned to it in liberal democratic theory. Such disobedience has always been of concern to the dominant classes. Just keeping to American history, George Washington regarded the common people who formed the militias that he was to command as an exceedingly dirty and nasty people, evincing an unaccountable kind of stupidity in the lower class of these people. In Violent Politi-FS, his masterful review of insurgencies from the American insurgency to contemporary Afghanistan and Iraq, William Polk concludes that General Washington was so anxious to sideline the fighters he despised that he came close to losing the revolution. Indeed, he might have actually done so had France not massively intervened and saved the revolution, which until then had been won by guerrillas, whom we would now call terrorists, while Washington's British-style army was defeated time after time and almost lost the war. A common feature of successful insurgencies, Polk records, is that once popular support dissolves after victory, the leadership suppresses the dirty and nasty people who actually won the war with guerrilla tactics and terror, for fear that they might challenge class privilege. The elite's contempt for the lower class of these people has taken various forms throughout the years. In recent times, one expression of this contempt is the call for passivity and obedience, moderation in democracy, by liberal internationalists reacting to the dangerous democratizing effects of the popular movements of the 1960s. Sometimes states do choose to follow public opinion, eliciting much fury in centers of power. One dramatic case was in 2003, when the Bush administration called on Turkey to join its invasion of Iraq. 95% of Turks opposed that course of action and, to the amazement and horror of Washington, the Turkish government adhered to their views. Turkey was bitterly condemned for this departure from responsible behavior. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, designated by the press as the idealist-in-chief of the administration, berated the Turkish military for permitting the malfeasance of the government and demanded an apology. Unperturbed by these and innumerable other illustrations of our fabled yearning for democracy, respectable commentary continued to laud President George W. Bush for his dedication to democracy promotion, or sometimes criticized him for his naivete in thinking that an outside power could impose its democratic yearnings on others. The Turkish public was not alone. Global opposition to US-UK aggression was overwhelming. Support for Washington's war plans scarcely reached 10% almost anywhere, according to international polls. Opposition sparked huge worldwide protests in the United States as well, probably the first time in history that imperial aggression was strongly protested even before it was officially launched. On the front page of the New York Times, journalist Patrick Tyler reported that there may still be two superpowers on the planet, the United States and world public opinion. Unprecedented protest in the United States was a manifestation of the opposition to aggression that began decades earlier in the condemnation of the U.S. wars in Indochina, reaching a scale that was substantial and influential, even if far too late. By 1967, when the anti-war movement was becoming a significant force, military historian and Vietnam specialist Bernard Fall warned that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction. As the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. But the anti-war movement did become a force that could not be ignored. Nor could it be ignored when Ronald Reagan came into office determined to launch an assault on Central America. His administration mimicked closely the steps John F. Kennedy had taken 20 years earlier in launching the war against South Vietnam, but had to back off because of the kind of vigorous public protest that had been lacking in the early 1960s. The assault was awful enough. The victims have yet to recover. But what happened to South Vietnam and later all of Indochina, where the second superpower imposed its impediments only much later in the conflict, was incomparably worse. It is often argued that the enormous public opposition to the invasion of Iraq had no effect. That seems incorrect to me. Again, the invasion was horrifying enough, and its aftermath is utterly grotesque. Nevertheless, it could have been far worse. Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and the rest of Bush's top officials could never even contemplate the sort of measures that President Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson adopted 40 years earlier, largely without protest. Western power under pressure. There is far more to say, of course, about the factors in determining state policy that are put to the side when we adopt the standard convention that states are the actors in international affairs. But with such non-trivial caveats as these, let us nevertheless adopt the convention, at least as a first approximation to reality. Then the question of who rules the world leads at once to such concerns as China's rise to power and its challenge to the United States and world order, the new Cold War simmering in Eastern Europe, the global war on terror, American hegemony and American decline, and a range of similar considerations. The challenges faced by Western power at the outset of 2016 are usefully summarized within the conventional framework by Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs columnist for the London Financial Times. He begins by reviewing the Western picture of world order. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the overwhelming power of the U.S. military has been the central fact of international politics. This is particularly crucial in three regions: East Asia, where the U.S. Navy has become used to treating the Pacific as an American lake; Europe, where NATO, meaning the United States, which accounts for a staggering 3/4 of NATO's military spending, guarantees the territorial integrity of its member states; and the Middle East, where giant U.S. naval and air bases exist to reassure friends and to intimidate rivals. The problem of world order today, Rachman continues, is that these security orders are now under challenge in all three regions because of Russian intervention in Ukraine and Syria, and because of China turning its nearby seas from an American lake to clearly contested water. The fundamental question of international relations, then, is whether the United States should accept that other major powers should have some kind of zone of influence in their neighborhoods. Rachman thinks it should, for reasons of diffusion of economic power around the world, combined with simple common sense. There are, to be sure, ways of looking at the world from different standpoints. But let us keep to these three regions, surely critically important ones. The challenges today: East Asia. Beginning with the American lake, some eyebrows might be raised over the report in mid-December 2015 that an American B-52 bomber on a routine mission over the South China Sea unintentionally flew within 2 nautical miles of an artificial island built by China, senior defense officials said, exacerbating a hotly divisive issue for Washington and Beijing. Those familiar with the grim record of the 70 years of the nuclear weapons era will be all too aware that this is the kind of incident that has often come perilously close to igniting terminal nuclear war. One need not be a supporter of China's provocative and aggressive actions in the South China Sea to notice that the incident did not involve a Chinese nuclear-capable bomber in the Caribbean, or off the coast of California, where China has no pretensions of establishing a Chinese lake. Luckily for the world, Chinese leaders understand very well that their country's maritime trade routes are ringed with hostile powers from Japan through the Malacca Straits and beyond, backed by overwhelming U.S. military force. Accordingly, China is proceeding to expand westward with extensive investments and careful moves toward integration. In part, these developments are within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, which includes the Central Asian states and Russia, and soon India and Pakistan, with Iran as one of the observers, a status that was denied to the United States, which was also called on to close all military bases in the region. China is constructing a modernized version of the old Silk Roads, with the intent not only of integrating the region under Chinese influence, but also of reaching Europe and the Middle Eastern oil-producing regions. It is pouring huge sums into creating an integrated Asian energy and commercial system, with extensive high-speed rail lines and pipelines. One element of the program is a highway through some of the world's tallest mountains to the new Chinese-developed port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which will protect oil shipments from potential U.S. interference. The program may also, China and Pakistan hope, spur industrial development in Pakistan, which the United States has not undertaken despite massive military aid, and might also provide an incentive for Pakistan to clamp down on domestic terrorism, a serious issue for China in western Xinjiang province. Gwadar will be part of China's string of pearls, bases being constructed in the Indian Ocean for commercial purposes but potentially also for military use, with the expectation that China might someday be able to project power as far as the Persian Gulf for the first time in the modern era. All of these moves remain immune to Washington's overwhelming military power, short of annihilation by nuclear war, which would destroy the United States as well. In 2015, China also established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, with itself as the main shareholder. 56 nations participated in the opening in Beijing in June, including U.S. allies Australia, Britain, and others which joined in defiance of Washington's wishes. The United States and Japan were absent. Some analysts believe that the new bank might turn out to be a competitor to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, in which the United States holds veto power. There are also some expectations that the SCO might eventually become a counterpart to NATO. The challenges today, Eastern Europe. Turning to the second region, Eastern Europe, there is a crisis brewing at the NATO-Russian border. It is no small matter. In his illuminating and judicious scholarly study of the region, Richard Sakwa writes, all too plausibly, that the Russo-Georgian War of August 2008 was in effect the first of the wars to stop NATO enlargement. The Ukraine crisis of 2014 is the second. It is not clear whether humanity would survive a third. The West sees NATO enlargement as benign. Not surprisingly, Russia, along with much of the global South, has a different opinion, as do some prominent Western voices. George Kennan warned early on that NATO enlargement is a tragic mistake, and he was joined by senior American statesmen in an open letter to the White House describing it as a policy error of historic proportions. The present crisis has its origins in 1991, with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were then two contrasting visions of a new security system and political economy in Eurasia. In Sakwa's words, one vision was of a wider Europe, with the EU at its heart but increasingly coterminous with the Euro-Atlantic security and political community, and on the other side there was the idea of Greater Europe, a vision of a continental Europe, stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok, that has multiple centers, including Brussels, Moscow and Ankara, but with a common purpose in overcoming the divisions that have traditionally plagued the continent. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was the major proponent of Greater Europe, a concept that also had European roots in Gaullism and other initiatives. However, as Russia collapsed under the devastating market reforms of the 1990s, the vision faded, only to be renewed as Russia began to recover and seek a place on the world stage under Vladimir Putin, who, along with his associate Dmitry Medvedev, has repeatedly called for the geopolitical unification of all of Greater Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, to create a genuine strategic partnership. These initiatives were greeted with polite contempt, Sakwa writes, regarded as little more than a cover for the establishment of a Greater Russia by stealth and an effort to drive a wedge between North America and Western Europe. Such concerns trace back to earlier Cold War fears that Europe might become a third force independent of both the great and minor superpowers and moving toward closer links to the latter, as can be seen in Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik and other initiatives. The Western response to Russia's collapse was triumphalist. It was hailed as signaling the end of history, the final victory of Western capitalist democracy, almost as if Russia were being instructed to revert to its pre-World War I status as a virtual economic colony of the West. NATO enlargement began at once, in violation of verbal assurances to Gorbachev that NATO forces would not move 1 inch to the east after he agreed that a unified Germany could become a NATO member, a remarkable concession, in the light of history. That discussion kept to East Germany. The possibility that NATO might expand beyond Germany was not discussed with Gorbachev, even if privately considered. Soon, NATO did begin to move beyond, right to the borders of Russia. The general mission of NATO was officially changed to a mandate to protect crucial infrastructure of the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, giving it a global area of operations. Furthermore, under a crucial Western revision of the now widely heralded doctrine of responsibility to protect, sharply different from the official UN version, NATO may now also serve as an intervention force under US command. Of particular concern to Russia are plans to expand NATO to Ukraine. These plans were articulated explicitly at the Bucharest NATO summit of April 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine were promised eventual membership in NATO. The wording was unambiguous: NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. With the Orange Revolution victory of pro-Western candidates in Ukraine in 2004, State Department Representative Daniel Fried rushed there and emphasized U.S. support for Ukraine's NATO and Euro-Atlantic aspirations, as a WikiLeaks report revealed. Russia's concerns are easily understandable. They are outlined by international relations scholar John Mearsheimer in the leading U.S. establishment journal, Foreign Affairs. He writes that the taproot of the current crisis over Ukraine is NATO expansion and Washington's commitment to move Ukraine out of Moscow's orbit and integrate it into the West, which Putin viewed as a direct threat to Russia's core interests. Who can blame him? Mearsheimer asks, pointing out that Washington may not like Moscow's position, but it should understand the logic behind it. That should not be too difficult. After all, as everyone knows, the United States does not tolerate distant great powers deploying military forces anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, much less on its borders. In fact, the U.S. stand is far stronger. It does not tolerate what is officially called successful defiance of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which declared, but could not yet implement, U.S. control of the hemisphere. And a small country that carries out such successful defiance may be subjected to the terrors of the earth and a crushing embargo, as happened to Cuba. We need not ask how the United States would have reacted had the countries of Latin America joined the Warsaw Pact, with plans for Mexico and Canada to join as well. The merest hint of the first tentative steps in that direction would have been terminated with extreme prejudice, to adopt CIA lingo. As in the case of China, one does not have to regard Putin's moves and motives favorably to understand the logic behind them, nor to grasp the importance of understanding that logic instead of issuing imprecations against it. As in the case of China, a great deal is at stake, reaching as far, literally, as questions of survival. The challenge is today, the Islamic world. Let us turn to the third region of major concern, the largely Islamic world, also the scene of the global war on terror, GWOT, that George W. Bush declared in 2001 after the 9/11 terrorist attack. To be more accurate, redeclared. The GWOT was declared by the Reagan administration when it took office, with fevered rhetoric about a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself, as Reagan put it, and a return to barbarism in the modern age, the words of George Shultz, his Secretary of State. The original GWOT has been quietly removed from history. It very quickly turned into a murderous and destructive terrorist war afflicting Central America, Southern Africa, and the Middle East, with grim repercussions to the present, even leading to condemnation of the United States by the World Court, which Washington dismissed. In any event, it is not the right story for history, so it is gone. The success of the Bush-Obama version of GWOT can readily be evaluated on direct inspection. When the war was declared, the terrorist targets were confined to a small corner of tribal Afghanistan. They were protected by Afghans, who mostly disliked or despised them, under the tribal code of hospitality, which baffled Americans when poor peasants refused to turn over Osama bin Laden for the, to them, astronomical sum of $25 million. There are good reasons to believe that a well-constructed police action, or even serious diplomatic negotiations with the Taliban, might have placed those suspected of the 9/11 crimes in American hands for trial and sentencing. But such options were off the table. Instead, the reflexive choice was large-scale violence, not with the goal of overthrowing the Taliban, that came later, but to make clear U.S. contempt for tentative Taliban offers of the possible extradition of bin Laden. How serious these offers were we do not know, since the possibility of exploring them was never entertained. Or perhaps the United States was just intent on trying to show its muscle, score a victory and scare everyone in the world. They don't care about the suffering of the Afghans or how many people we will lose. That was the judgment of the highly respected anti-Taliban leader Abdul Haq, one of the many oppositionists who condemned the American bombing campaign launched in October 2001 as a big setback for their efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, a goal they considered within their reach. His judgment is confirmed by Richard A. Clarke, who was chairman of the Counterterrorism Security Group at the White House under President George W. Bush when the plans to attack Afghanistan were made. As Clarke describes the meeting, when informed that the attack would violate international law, the president yelled in the narrow conference room, "I don't care what the international lawyers say, we are going to kick some ass." The attack was also bitterly opposed by the major aid organizations working in Afghanistan, who warned that millions were on the verge of starvation and that the consequences might be horrendous. The consequences for poor Afghanistan years later need hardly be reviewed. The next target of the sledgehammer was Iraq. The US-UK invasion, utterly without credible pretext, is the major crime of the 21st century. The invasion led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people in a country where the civilian society had already been devastated by American and British sanctions that were regarded as genocidal by the two distinguished international diplomats who administered them, and resigned in protest for this reason. 21 The invasion also generated millions of refugees, largely destroyed the country, and instigated a sectarian conflict that is now tearing apart Iraq and the entire region. It is an astonishing fact about our intellectual and moral culture that in informed and enlightened circles it can be called, blandly, the liberation of Iraq. Pentagon and British Ministry of Defense polls found that only 3% of Iraqis regarded the U.S. security role in their neighborhood as legitimate, less than 1% believed that coalition, US-UK, forces were good for their security, 80% opposed the presence of coalition forces in the country, and a majority supported attacks on coalition troops. Afghanistan has been destroyed beyond the possibility of reliable polling, but there are indications that something similar may be true there as well. Particularly in Iraq, the United States suffered a severe defeat, abandoning its official war aims, and leaving the country under the influence of the sole victor, Iran. The sledgehammer was also wielded elsewhere, notably in Libya, where the three traditional imperial powers, Britain, France, and the United States, procured Security Council Resolution 1973 and instantly violated it, becoming the Air Force of the rebels. The effect was to undercut the possibility of a peaceful, negotiated settlement, sharply increase casualties, by at least a factor of 10, according to political scientist Alan Cooperman, leave Libya in ruins, in the hands of warring militias, and, more recently, to provide the Islamic State with a base that it can use to spread terror beyond. Quite sensible diplomatic proposals by the African Union, accepted in principle by Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, were ignored by the imperial triumvirate, as Africa specialist Alex Duvall reviews. A huge flow of weapons and jihadis has spread terror and violence from West Africa, now the champion for terrorist murders, to the Levant, while the NATO attack also sent a flood of refugees from Africa to Europe. Yet another triumph of humanitarian intervention, and, as the long and often ghastly record reveals, not an unusual one, going back to its modern origins 4 centuries ago. The costs of violence. In brief, the GWOT sledgehammer strategy has spread jihadi terror from a tiny corner of Afghanistan to much of the world, from Africa through the Levant and South Asia to Southeast Asia. It has also incited attacks in Europe and the United States. The invasion of Iraq made a substantial contribution to this process, much as intelligence agencies had predicted. Terrorism specialists Peter Bergen and Paul Cruikshank estimate that the Iraq War generated a stunning seven-fold increase in the yearly rate of fatal jihadist attacks, amounting to literally hundreds of additional terrorist attacks and thousands of civilian lives lost. Even when terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan is excluded, fatal attacks in the rest of the world have increased by more than one-third. Other exercises have been similarly productive. A group of major human rights organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility, U.S., Physicians for Global Survival, Canada, and International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Germany, conducted a study that sought to provide as realistic an estimate as possible of the total body count in the three main war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, during 12 years of war on terrorism, including an extensive review of the major studies and data published on the numbers of victims in these countries, along with additional information on military actions. Their conservative estimate is that these wars killed about 1.3 million people, a toll that could also be in excess of 2 million. A database search by independent researcher David Peterson in the days following the publication of the report found virtually no mention of it. Who cares? More generally, studies carried out by the Oslo Peace Research Institute show that two-thirds of the region's conflict fatalities were produced in originally internal disputes where outsiders imposed their solutions. In such conflicts, 98% of fatalities were produced only after outsiders had entered the domestic dispute with their military might. In Syria, the number of direct conflict fatalities more than tripled after the West initiated air strikes against the self-declared Islamic State and the CIA started its indirect military interference in the war, interference which appears to have drawn the Russians in as advanced U.S. anti-tank missiles were decimating the forces of their ally Bashar al-Assad. Early indications are that Russian bombing is having the usual consequences. The evidence reviewed by political scientist Timo Kivimaki indicates that the protection wars, fought by coalitions of the willing, have become the main source of violence in the world, occasionally contributing over 50% of total conflict fatalities. Furthermore, in many of these cases, including Syria, as he reviews, there were opportunities for diplomatic settlement that were ignored. As discussed elsewhere, that has also been true in other horrific situations, including the Balkans in the early 1990s, the First Gulf War, and of course the Indochina Wars, the worst crime since World War II. In the case of Iraq, the question does not even arise. There surely are some lessons here. The general consequences of resorting to the sledgehammer against vulnerable societies comes as little surprise. William Polk's careful study of insurgencies, cited above, should be essential reading for those who want to understand today's conflicts, and surely for planners, assuming that they care about human consequences and not merely power and domination. Polk reveals a pattern that has been replicated over and over. The invaders, perhaps professing the most benign motives, are naturally disliked by the population, who disobey them at first in small ways, eliciting a forceful response, which increases opposition and support for resistance. The cycle of violence escalates until the invaders withdraw, or gain their ends by something that may approach genocide. Obama's global drone assassination campaign, a remarkable innovation in global terrorism, exhibits the same patterns. By most accounts, it is generating terrorists more rapidly than it is murdering those suspected of someday intending to harm us, an impressive contribution by a constitutional lawyer on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, which established the basis for the principle of presumption of innocence that is the foundation of civilized law. Another characteristic feature of such interventions is the belief that the insurgency will be overcome by eliminating its leaders. But when such an effort succeeds, the reviled leader is regularly replaced by someone younger, more determined, more brutal, and more effective. Polk gives many examples. Military historian Andrew Cockburn has reviewed American campaigns to kill drug and then terror kingpins over a long period in his important study Kill Chain and found the same results. And one can expect with fair confidence that the pattern will continue. No doubt right now US strategists are seeking ways to murder the caliph of the Islamic State Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is a bitter rival of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. The likely result of this achievement is forecast by the prominent terrorism scholar Bruce Hoffman, senior fellow at the U.S. Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. He predicts that al-Baghdadi's death would likely pave the way for a rapprochement with al-Qaeda, producing a combined terrorist force unprecedented in scope, size, ambition, and resources. Polk cites a treatise on warfare by Henry Jomini, influenced by Napoleon's defeat at the hands of Spanish guerrillas, that became a textbook for generations of cadets at the West Point Military Academy. Jomini observed that such interventions by major powers typically result in wars of opinion, and nearly always national wars, if not at first then becoming so in the course of the struggle, by the dynamics that Polk describes. Jomini concludes that commanders of regular armies are ill-advised to engage in such wars because they will lose them, and even apparent successes will prove short-lived. Careful studies of al-Qaeda and ISIS have shown that the United States and its allies are following their game plan with some precision. Their goal is to draw the West as deeply and actively as possible into the quagmire and to perpetually engage and enervate the United States and the West in a series of prolonged overseas ventures in which they will undermine their own societies, expend their resources, and increase the level of violence, setting off the dynamic that Polk reviews. Scott Atran, one of the most insightful researchers on jihadi movements, calculates that the 9/11 attacks cost between $400,000 and $500,000 to execute, whereas the military and security response by the U.S. and its allies is in the order of 10 million times that figure. On a strictly cost-benefit basis, this violent movement has been wildly successful, beyond even bin Laden's original imagination, and is increasingly so. Herein lies the full measure of jiu-jitsu-style asymmetric warfare. After all, who could claim that we are better off than before, or that the overall danger is declining? And if we continue to wield the sledgehammer, tacitly following the jihadi script, the likely effect is even more violent jihadism with broader appeal. The record, Atran advises, should inspire a radical change in our counter-strategies. Al-Qaeda/ISIS are assisted by Americans who follow their directives, for example, Ted Carpetbomb M. Cruz, a top Republican presidential candidate. Or, at the other end of the mainstream spectrum, the leading Middle East and international affairs columnist of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, who in 2003 offered Washington advice on how to fight in Iraq on The Charlie Rose Show. There was what I would call the terrorism bubble. And what we needed to do was to go over to that part of the world and burst that bubble. We needed to go over there basically, and, take out a very big stick right in the heart of that world, and burst that bubble. And there was only one way to do it. What they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad, and basically saying, which part of this sentence don't you understand? You don't think we care about our open society? You think this bubble fantasy we're going to just let it go? Well, suck on this. Okay. That, Charlie, was what this war was about. That'll show the ragheads. Looking forward. Atran and other close observers generally agree on the prescriptions. We should begin by recognizing what careful research has convincingly shown. Those drawn to jihad are longing for something in their history, in their traditions, with their heroes and their morals, and the Islamic State, however brutal and repugnant to us and even to most in the Arab Muslim world, is speaking directly to that. What inspires the most lethal assailants today is not so much the Quran but a thrilling cause and a call to action that promises glory and esteem in the eyes of friends. In fact, few of the jihadis have much of a background in Islamic texts or theology, if any. The best strategy, Polk advises, would be a multinational, welfare-oriented and psychologically satisfying program that would make the hatred ISIS relies upon less virulent. The elements have been identified for us: communal needs, compensation for previous transgressions, and calls for a new beginning. He adds, a carefully phrased apology for past transgressions would cost little and do much. Such a project could be carried out in refugee camps or in the hovels and grim housing projects of the Paris banlieues, where, Atran writes, his research team found fairly wide tolerance or support for ISIS's values. And even more could be done by true dedication to diplomacy and negotiations instead of reflexive resort to violence. Not least in significance would be an honorable response to the refugee crisis that was a long time in coming but surged to prominence in Europe in 2015. That would mean, at the very least, sharply increasing humanitarian relief to the camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey where miserable refugees from Syria barely survive. But the issues go well beyond, and provide a picture of the self-described enlightened states that is far from attractive and should be an incentive to action. There are countries that generate refugees through massive violence, like the United States, secondarily Britain and France. Then there are countries that admit huge numbers of refugees, including those fleeing from Western violence, like Lebanon, easily the champion, per capita, Jordan, and Syria before it imploded, among others in the region. And partially overlapping, there are countries that both generate refugees and refuse to take them in, not only from the Middle East but also from the U.S. backyard south of the border. A strange picture, painful to contemplate. An honest picture would trace the generation of refugees much further back into history. Veteran Middle East correspondent Robert Fisk reports that one of the first videos produced by ISIS showed a bulldozer pushing down a rampart of sand that had marked the border between Iraq and Syria. As the machine destroyed the dirt revetment, the camera panned down to a handwritten poster lying in the sand. "End of Sykes-Picot," it said. For the people of the region, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is the very symbol of the cynicism and brutality of Western imperialism. Conspiring in secret during World War I, Britain's Mark Sykes and France's François-Georges Picot carved up the region into artificial states to satisfy their own imperial goals, with utter disdain for the interests of the people living there and in violation of the wartime promises issued to induce Arabs to join the Allied war effort. The agreement mirrored the practices of the European states that devastated Africa in a similar manner. It transformed what had been relatively quiet provinces of the Ottoman Empire into some of the least stable and most internationally explosive states in the world. Repeated Western interventions since then in the Middle East and Africa have exacerbated the tensions, conflicts, and disruptions that have shattered the societies. The end result is a refugee crisis that the innocent West can scarcely endure. Germany has emerged as the conscience of Europe, at first, but no longer, admitting almost 1 million refugees, in one of the richest countries in the world with a population of 80 million. In contrast, the poor country of Lebanon has absorbed an estimated 1.5 million Syrian refugees, now a quarter of its population, on top of 500,000 Palestinian refugees registered with the UN Refugee Agency UNRWA, mostly victims of Israeli policies. Europe is also groaning under the burden of refugees from the countries it has devastated in Africa, not without US aid, as Congolese and Angolans, among others, can testify. Europe is now seeking to bribe Turkey, with over 2 million Syrian refugees, to distance those fleeing the horrors of Syria from Europe's borders, just as Obama is pressuring Mexico to keep U.S. borders free from miserable people seeking to escape the aftermath of Reagan's GWOT, along with those seeking to escape more recent disasters, including a military coup in Honduras that Obama almost alone legitimized, which created one of the worst horror chambers in the region. Words can hardly capture the U.S. response to the Syrian refugee crisis, at least any words I can think of. Returning to the opening question, who rules the world, we might also want to pose another question: what principles and values rule the world? That question should be foremost in the minds of the citizens of the rich and powerful states, who enjoy an unusual legacy of freedom, privilege, and opportunity thanks to the struggles of those who came before them, and who now face fateful choices as to how to respond to challenges of great human import.